So, yeah, you can get it set. This is the first time we've used these things.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so you got everything that you need?
I think I'm good. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so first thing, just like we talked about out there, first thing we'll do is just take a deep breath just to kind of settle into the experience. So one deep breath in, one deep breath out. Welcome to the Unscripted room.
Thanks for having me.
Our theme is risk versus reward, but the lens that we'll look at risk versus reward through is motorsports. And I couldn't ask for a better guest to be able to do this topic with, because as I was talking to you about, out there, genuinely admire how good of a driver you are. I know how tough motorsports is, and I've seen you, we've experienced motorsports together, but I've seen you do some extraordinary things behind the wheel. And so excited to dive into this topic and figure out how sort of what both of us have experienced in risk versus reward on the track might apply to anything else in wherever this conversation goes. We'll have 3 questions that we start with that will kind of allow us to kind of talk a little bit about our past. Then the next 3 questions in the second hour, we'll start focusing on how we apply what we've learned to our present. And then in the third hour, we'll start focusing on the combination of, what we've learned and how we're applying it and where we think that goes to our vision for the future. So excited for you to be here, excited to have this experience with you. If you're ready and you want to get started, we can get started with you reading question 1 and we'll go.
Yeah, that sounds good, and thank you for that kind introduction. All right. So, you have not seen these questions either?
So I wrote all these questions, but my memory is so terrible that if you asked me what this question was, I wouldn't remember it for sure.
So the first question is, what does racing teach someone about knowing which risks are worth taking and which ones should be avoided? And, I think part of the theme that we'll talk about, or, one of the things that's most interesting to me about racing is the overall level of complexity makes it hit on what I would call more levels than just about anything else that, I've ever been a part of, or for that matter, really seen. There's a, obvious forward-facing part of it that is the actual get out. And, in this case, we'll probably talk mostly about driving cars, but yeah. I think this applies to a lot of motorsports, obviously. I'm a big fan of motorcycle racing and off-road drive. There's a bunch of things there.
And we should give context to anybody who does end up watching this that you and I understand one discipline, right? So we've done motorsports racing. You've gone to the highest level in, what you can do in motorsports racing. But when you get into rally, when you get into even NASCAR, open wheel like Formula One, it's still driving, but it's a different discipline of driving that you could be very, very good at motorsports, but have to almost start from the ground up if you switch to one of those other disciplines.
Yeah, I would say motorsports as a category has hundreds, if not thousands of, different, ways of participating.
It's like being really good at jiu-jitsu, but not necessarily ready to step into an MMA ring with somebody who knows how to do
or I
all
talk about
of the
football and rugby. That like you would expect an NFL player to have some jump in proficiency ability in rugby, but at the highest level, they wouldn't be able to be, competing with other pros that have focused on that for long enough and that sort of thing. So, yeah, but I think there is some commonality across a lot of the different motorsports applications. I tend to break it down and think about it a little bit between endurance motorsports and non-endurance. Drag racing is 4 to 12 seconds of kind of thing.
Right. That's almost like preparation to execute, and the execution is exciting, but not necessarily the skill.
Right. And there's a few types of motorsports that are more in that, lots of preparation, lots of, things like that. But the execution is doesn't require the same mental focus.
Yeah.
Still huge credit to people that can get in there and do it, but just sort of different. So
Yeah.
So anyways, the question, how do you learn about what risks are worth taking and which ones should be avoided? One of the great things about sports in general, and we started to talk about this, but then I think racing, as I mentioned, is one of the most true life lesson teaching things out there.
Yeah.
Is that it's an environment where you get almost instant feedback about whether your risk worked or didn't work, and in a truly measurable way. That's one of the things that fits my personality really well, is that it's measurable, right? It's not a judge, maybe deciding whether they liked it or didn't like it. Either you go faster or you don't, and there's a measurement for that. And so that's pretty good.
There's a universal truth to it that is inescapable for sure.
Right. There's takes away, there is no debating. Either it happened or it didn't happen, which is very real.
Yeah.
So I think that, that format creates some interesting habits or options around risk taking. And especially in something like endurance racing, where you can do the same thing 100 times, or as close as you can to doing the same thing 100 times. That's one of the challenges there. But you can also test, and I'm gonna amp the risk up just a little bit and see what happens. And I'm gonna get a feedback on that right away. And I'm gonna amp the risk up just a little bit and see what happens. So it, in my mind, I think teaches that two things, which are, one is the incremental level, the difference between a small risk and a big risk, and how to, fold that into a bigger picture. And then limiting the variables so that you're, risking in one spot. But if you risk in too many spots all at once, you don't even know what risk paid off, what risk harmed you, those kind of things. So
can we, just because I'm assuming that some people who listen to this maybe some people will have a concept of what motorsports is. Very, very few people have ever driven on a track. So maybe can you just give a little bit of a background of how you describe motorsports being different than what people are experiencing when they're driving? What is the technique that's the difference between what people can relate to versus what you're actually experiencing on the track?
Yeah, it's really difficult to relate that to people. And, I think, I know we had the same experience, that we grew up with a mother who, was around it for 20 something years and heard us talk about it and try and describe it and everything. And then took her for one ride in a race car for 2 laps was all that she could handle it. And it, totally changed the whole perspective, because until you're in it and feel the everything all at once nature of it, to, kind of go back to past podcast, I guess. But, you're inundated with the input, and meanwhile you have to keep absolute focus and, execute mentally and physically together at the same time and that's the driving portion. Yeah. And then one of the, things that makes motorsports very interesting to me is that's the tip of the spear, the actual competition portion of it, and the driving. But then depending on what motorsport, that can be somewhere between maybe 5% and 50% of the overall activity, where there's all of this other stuff that happens that makes it possible, makes it happen, and contributes to the success or not success of it all and everything, which is, a big part of it as well.
And just to give that some color, I think what you're saying is that, like, for anybody that's never experienced this, if you just see cars going around the track, you get one sense of what racing is. But when you actually are doing it, what you realize is that the trucks and the trailers and all of the preparation and all of the work that you had to do in your car to show up to the track for the weekend, all of this stuff, you had to do a lot of stuff to be in a position to compete before you ever get there. Then you have to go out on track. And I would say the thing that was surprising to me, and I couldn't even understand it at the time because I was 19 maybe the first time that I went out on track, something like that. And it's a deeply emotional experience, which is, I think, what you don't expect. Emotional in the way that that it's scary. And I never feared for my own personal safety. I actually don't think that racing is all that unsafe. I think that there's way less people who injure themselves or lose their life racing than there are probably people who are playing football or other sports, right? So the safety component wasn't that, but it's the amount of money that you've invested to get this thing out onto the track, and then the fear that if you mess up even a little tiny bit, that you could end up making a mistake that takes all of that investment, all of that time, and it all goes away. So you're trying to do something at the peak of what you can do, but you also have this other emotional thing going on where you're trying to make sure that you can keep doing that thing without, wrecking out. And it's a really interesting mix of emotions and focus at any given time, and then on top of that, there's the tactical skills that it takes to be able to hold a car in a corner at its maximum speed, which, if nobody's ever done before, I would describe as having to get used to constant movement of the car all the time, that you become comfortable understanding how much movement the car can have before it no longer has the grip to keep you going in the direction that you want to go. And you want to bring it right up to that very last bit of grip that you can find before that happens, which is an exhilarating place to be, but it's also very terrifying to try to explore where that edge is. I don't know if that seems like
Yeah, like I said, I think it's really hard to describe it, and so I think everyone has different ways. And I will circle back and just say, I think we talk a lot about sports car racing, which, I think to tell normal people is basically taking cars that people would loosely recognize, Porsches, Ferraris, the type of fancy cars that people think of as fast cars, and taking them out on a track that are called road courses because they roughly replicate what a normal road would be. It has, turns and hills and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But in a closed environment where ultimately you're looping the same thing, so you get to see the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
It's not, what we would call circle track, which is truly, the NASCAR event where people do that. But anyways, just to give that context to it.
And tracks are kind of like golf courses. Like you understand that there's a basic concept of how many holes will be there and what you're trying to do, but every track you go to is always different because there's infinite variables. Are you going uphill? How sharp is a corner? All of those kinds of things that you have to reconcile as soon as you get there and try to figure out not only how can you get around this thing, but how can you get around this thing as fast as you can possibly go. So it's a lot of instant calculation as a driver to figure it out.
Yeah, and I would expand a little bit on what you said about the different aspects of racing. And, so like I said, I think driving and being out there in the final competition from a time and investment standpoint is actually like the smallest part, but it's crucial, right? And it there's some level of like that teaches you about life too, that like just because something doesn't take as long or doesn't mean that it's not as important, right? Like there's different aspects to that. So being on track is this in a lot of ways the smallest part of the commitment of being
Definitely.
in motorsports, but it's unbelievably crucial, right? And the driver being the final operator ultimately is part of a larger team, for lack of a better word, or profile, but unbelievably critical, right? That's the hardest part to swap and still keep your performance, your overall performance going, kind of thing.
So you've won races. I've never won a race. Not at least, like lower level stuff where we got into doing endurance go-karting, that kind of thing, but never won a race at the regional SCCA level, and then never went above that in anything that I was doing. But I'm really curious. One of the things that was obvious to me, even from the very beginning when we started doing it, was that your risk and reward was different than mine. You had an edge of being able to take more risk, and you were getting higher rewards in the results that you were getting on track. There, no doubt about it. So I'm curious, to kind of go back to the question, and not that we have to stay on the question, but just curious, how do you calculate your risk and reward while you're out there? How do you start to figure out how much risk you want to take based on, where was your calculation? And maybe the answer is obvious, is that you wanted to win, and that was the reward that you were going for. So you had to take the risk to get to that point.
Yeah. I thought about this a little bit because I didn't know this was going to be a specific question, but obviously had some. I think I've always evaluated risk a little bit different than most of the people that I know and that are, directly around me, kind of thing.
Right.
And, with racing, I feel like I approach it differently than what I've heard you and, other people, in that were around. So, but for me, there's first and foremost, if I had invested everything that it took to get there and to do it, then I was invested in winning, and that was a really important, end result to me. And so that changes the risk profile of once you're out there, I'm looking at everything that has gone into it as I'm risking invalidating that or, devaluing that by not
giving justice to what you did.
Everything possible to maximize that, end result and win. So that certainly was a big driver, You mentioned it earlier, but racing includes a physical risk aspect. It just truly does.
Yeah.
But we were raised in an environment where physical risk was not really much of a focus, and we did a lot of things that got bumps and bruises and that sort of stuff. But I think sort of took that away from the forefront, where there are a lot of people who are, whether it's nature or nurture, come up in a different environment or just, are born with a different risk, physical risk tolerance profile. I really remember that I was never scared that I was going to get permanently physically hurt until actually when I was in my mid-20s, you watched me nearly crash my motorcycle.
That is by far the scariest thing that I've ever experienced in all of the motorsport things that and when you were the passenger in that Porsche that hit the wall at Watkins Glen, because I watched the windscreen on that car pop out and go however far that thing went, and then had to do an entire lap at Watkins Glen, which is like 5 miles long, before you get back and actually see that you were in good shape. So, but the motorcycle one, I mean, you'd probably worth telling the story, but that was a tough one to watch too.
Yeah. So, just to put a button on it, the Watkins Glen crash was interesting to me because it almost reinforced the lack of fear, because I was instructing somebody, they made a mistake in driving. We went off the track at probably 80, 85 miles an hour and hit the wall, probably still doing pretty close to that. We just slid sideways across wet grass,
right,
into a wall. The wall had these neat foam barriers that did a great job of
absorbing the car.
Of absorbing it. And we hit it pretty squarely on the side. The side that I was in is the side that hit the wall.
Huh. I didn't see it that way. I, for some reason, have a memory of you going head on into that barrier, but that.
We went in pretty dead sideways, and in fact, somewhere I think there's a picture. There's a foam block with almost the perfect outline of a Porsche 911 in it that came out of that.
Well, that makes you kind of lucky too man, because if you didn't have that absorption and you went sideways into something, trees, anything hard, that's kind of that is where you
that would have been really bad. But in the end, actually, that was one of the least
Right.
impactful to me. So I went off at 85 miles an hour, hit a wall, and in a car that wasn't even a fully prepped race car.
Yeah.
It didn't have the seats and the harnesses that the full safety gear that we run when we
Right.
were
Which you really should be
being more
running.
aggressive.
Yeah.
But so that almost reinforced the lack of physical fear part
Right.
that was out there. So I think that just naturally there was a part of that was not a part of my nature, kind of thing when I, went racing, that I wasn't afraid of that. We mentioned it, but the first time that motorcycles are different, and I have an unbelievable extra level of respect for people that do high-end motorcycle racing, because
Motorcycle racing and rally drivers, like, let's just give it to them right now, because those people, they, like the dude who climbs mountains without ropes, there's got to be something that you are just like, you to get a dopamine hit, you must have to do something so extreme to want to do those versions of motorsports.
Talk about risk versus reward. I grew up riding motorcycles. I got a fast motorcycle for the road. That was my entree to racing was,
Right.
Due to that. I started racing on the motorcycle,
Right, at Penguin School,
and was
right.
pretty successful, for the start there.
Right.
But instantly figured out that there was no way to not get permanently hurt.
Nice to have a cage around
if
you.
if you were going to race. So, evaluating risk versus reward, I, was less, I was less afraid, or whatever you want to call it, willing to take more risks in the sports car. But I was not willing to be a motorcycle racer. That was a risk that was too far for me, that, despite my competitiveness and my appreciation for it and everything, that was a risk that was too far for me from a physical standpoint, purely. The rest of it I love. So, yeah, I mean, and you did see me, riding on the road, hit a patch of sand at a relatively high speed and nearly crashed the motorcycle in a way that,
As close as you could come to,
right, going off the road at 60 or 70 miles an hour, with no protection, just, sort of getting thrown off of a motorcycle into whatever's on the side of the road.
And I kind of remember us being in a little bit of a neighborhood area where if you had gotten thrown off, you were definitely going into trees or mailboxes or something that was going to be solid.
Mailboxes and people's, front yard, whatever that, kind of thing. So, so I think there's that level of risk about it. There's also the analytical risk that I think my driving was different, that I have a very analytical mind, and I could find a way to drive very, very fast in a way that both didn't include a lot of mistakes, and also I felt like was always leaving me a margin of error that was reasonable for what I was doing. And interestingly, and maybe this is another one of those lessons that I've taken out for, my own good or not, but in racing, I found if you can't do it in a way that leaving that margin of error, or if you're doing it in a way that has no margin of error, it's actually not going to be fast anyways. And if you're intentionally the interesting part is if you're intentionally leaving it because you want a margin of error, it probably is slowing you down. But there's a way to do it that has a margin of error, but is also the peak performance.
So how are you, what are you trying to identify? And maybe I'll try to give a little commentary to what people might understand about what so fundamentally racing, I would say, has three critical components to it. It's how well you can control the braking of the vehicle coming in to a corner where you need to slow down. And then it's how effective you are at being able to get back onto the throttle to be able to carry speed outside of that. And then there's other corners that you go through where you have to be effective at being able to maintain extremely high speeds using either, the throttle or a little bit of trail braking to make sure that you're keeping the car moving in the right direction while cornering, simultaneously carrying as much speed as you can. So that doesn't seem like a lot that you have to calculate at any given time, but the difference between how well you could do it and how well I could do it could end up being a second a lap difference, more than a second a lap sometimes, in finding those just a little bit deeper into a braking zone, just a little bit faster getting back on the throttle, just a little bit more cornering speed going through a place that makes you feel uncomfortable. All of those things over 12, 13, 14, 15 corners on a racetrack can all of a sudden add up to a pretty significant difference between one driver and another driver. So how are you calculating that braking zone, that back on the throttle? Like, what are you looking for that allows you to know that?
Yeah, so that's where partly there's like actual data that, is going to relate to you, what's the whole picture of getting through this the fastest, and what's the clock saying, kind of thing. But
right.
And there's a balance, which is another thing to learn, that you could potentially brake later and it would make one section seem better, but if that impacts the next section negatively because you can't get to the right speed to make the turn that you talked about, then
right.
And that's the level of calculation about how do I maximize this and not upset the next thing, and and set up for the next thing after that, and constantly be figuring that out, and then throwing in that there's competition that is trying to force you not to do what is optimal for you,
right.
or
right, which you're constantly adapting to in real time.
Constantly adapting to in real time. So, there's all those kind of calculations going on, but in the most like basic sense of it, if you know how to manage, there's like two parts to it. One is just literally maximizing what the car can do as far as the tire adhesion and the application of the power kind of thing.
Right.
And that's a lot of just a practice thing, right? And understanding what can a car do and all that sort of thing.
And engineering. If you're smart about your setup and how you like even something as small as setting your tire pressures appropriately makes an enormous difference in the results that you get. So if you take that and you extrapolate that out into like, making adjustments to your suspension, making adjustments to your, to the camber, like all of the things that you can do to maximize the amount of tire that touches the road to give you more grip. A really good engineer and a really good mechanic coming in can be a second faster than somebody else just because they were better at setting up their car.
Yeah, and right, and that goes back to there's the multiple pieces. In fact, I'll circle back to that to just say, like at a broad sense, I think that one of the things that makes endurance motorsports most interesting to me is that it has the athletic component to it of the event and being out there, and there's a level of focus that I don't think any other for real activities for 2 hours or 3 hours require the amount of focus that being a driver or a rider or whatever during an endurance motorsport, and especially at the top end. They look at the top end drivers in any of the series, you literally don't blink for an hour, or you might blink 5 or 6 times in an hour. You're so concentrated that you literally stop blinking, for amounts of time that there isn't really anything else. Even other dangerous activities, rock climbing or whatever, they all have some break element to them,
right?
Or really high-end sports, basketball, football, even soccer. They all have some other element of, a mental break or reset moment that endurance racing just doesn't
just in
have.
case anybody thinks that a pit stop is somehow relaxing, I think it's important to say that it's not. It's actually probably the most anxiety-ridden time because it's now out of your hands. and it's into somebody else's hands, and you've just got to sit there after all the work that you did to make sure that you didn't lose a fraction of a second every lap that you were doing, and now you could lose so many seconds by
and
sitting
you're
in a pit
still
stop.
also trying to process and get every part of that right, and that's
Yeah.
different than what you've been doing. So you got to reset your mind to, I got to make sure that I'm entering the pit properly and exiting
Yeah,
it. But
it's just a lot. Yeah.
So that's one part, and that's the most visible part, is that, sport aspect of it, of the activity. The second part is the like engineering and the building something aspect, that there are people who leave NASA to go to motorsports because you learn stuff there that, like,
Right.
the level of engineering and complexity and what, that, and that's very interesting to me, the real world piece of that.
Right.
Most sports, tennis rackets probably have some level of engineering, but it's not the same. Like, and to be in it and be competitive, you have to be able to not just be an athlete, but also have some level of technical knowledge and
Yeah.
a level that is greater than almost any other sport, kind of thing. So that's interesting.
Is it fair to say that, like, there have been really great drivers who made it pretty far in their career, but the ones who have sustained their career for the longest are ones who understood the dynamics of the vehicle, understood how vehicles work really well, and were amazing drivers? Like, that's a combination that is almost necessary to get to the highest level?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, like just about anything else, and the more that you get out there, you see it, that talent alone can get you, quite a ways, actually, and it is really critical to getting started in things.
Right.
But ultimate success, meaning the tippity top of the top, is never just talent. It has to be a level of work and a level of maximization of everything, which in motorsports would include that technical aspect. There's nobody who's made it to the very, very top on strictly talent, kind of thing. And then the sustaining, for sure, is that next level of work, and that would, require that. So yes, I would say that the people who have both made it to the very, very top and especially sustain that, also were highly, highly technically capable and involved, and all that. So there's that aspect. And then there's a third aspect that people who aren't in it don't think about and don't understand, which is you have to understand and operate the business end of it to do it as well.
Yeah.
And that it's a very different thing, where if you're the best basketball player, the business end is going to work itself out, and somebody's going to find you and, help you through and keep moving, so long as you're the best.
Yeah. Yeah.
In motorsports, it's not that way. You have to bring a business case to it that makes sense, either for you or for somebody else.
Right.
But
which is almost never a good business case for racing. It's very difficult. I think the ongoing joke that everybody has about racing is that the best way to make a small fortune in racing is to start with a big one.
Yeah. So, but it's very unique in that it has all three of those things are super critical. You can't do it without all three of those, or some level of those. So so fundamentally, and then when it comes to the risk versus reward, that's true in all of those categories.
Yes.
And then they all add up to your final outcome. So do you want to risk more money, and where are you getting that from, and how are you doing that, and how are you investing that? Technically, how risky are you going to be on, changes that you make to the car, updates that you do, within the rules. Pushing the edge of the rules is another interesting part of, motorsports that is out there, and just choices that you make to deal with the conditions of the day, or trying to maximize your car. There's a million technical choices too that go into it. And then there's the on-track athletic level performance of driving the vehicle and operating it, and those all play together, and you're making risk reward decisions on all of those layers to get to an ultimate performance, which is...
I haven't been at the track in so long. I haven't really thought about how many different layers there were to, decisions that we were making on any given day in any moment, you know, like you see a cloud roll by and it's a little dark and you're like, oh God, do I, you know, like, because I think if you've never experienced it before, the anxiety of getting it wrong is really, really high. If you're out on track and all of a sudden it starts to rain and you're on tires that have no tread on them at all, it's you always seem to handle that way better than I did, but I found it to be an excruciating level of anxiety to try to figure out how you just, you know, keep this thing on track, because it is not ice, but it's as close as you can get to trying to figure out like, how would you drive a normal car on ice. That's a little bit what it's like to be on slicks on a racetrack when it's raining.
Yeah, I mean, the one real just my own fault crash that I had was it started raining on one end of the track. I was in the lead. I came to the wet spot first, and it had no traction, and I crashed. You know, that's kind of how that happens. But going back to your thing about you know, risk and taking it within the race, at each of those levels or different components, you know, I think I more so than a lot of people was sitting down and thinking about the risk, but the complete picture of like the risk and the reward. And a lot of times the piece that I think is not talked, the risk is interesting because there's like the iceberg piece, right? There's the part of it that you can see.
Right.
And then there's probably, in most circumstances, all of this element that you can't see. And somewhat the same is true of reward. On the racing side, the other really interesting thing, and the one lesson that I clearly took out of it, you mentioned a little while ago that the difference between, you know, a good performance and a bad performance could be, you know, as much as 1 second a lap.
Yeah.
And most people hear 1 second and they think, what in the hell, how, that's nothing. And they're absolutely right. If you look at, you know, going around a racetrack for one lap is 200 seconds.
Yeah.
1 second is, you know, 0.5% difference.
Yep.
But in the end, if you can be 1 second a lap better than your previous best or than somebody else, that's, in racing terms, a massive difference. And, you know, and really the difference between first and second is really big. Mm-hmm. Not in absolute terms. In absolute terms, it's incredibly small. You race for 3 hours and you finish 10 seconds apart from each other.
Right.
In an absolute term, that is nothing. That's a rounding error of a rounding error that means nothing. But the feedback, the reward is massively outsized between first and second and second and 10th. Yeah. And so I did recognize that, you know, that pushing that extra little bit that got, you know, that made that extra little difference does have an outsized reward. Yeah. And that's something that is not, that I learned in racing, or that, you know, was specifically highlighted to me in racing, but I've seen it outside too. Right. You know, we both run businesses. If you're making a proposal, you know, and you change it by 2% to win it, you get 100% if you win it, or 0% if you don't. You know, the risk is 2%. The reward is 100 versus 0.
So I find what you're saying right now to be extremely interesting in a couple of ways. Number one, I don't know if we've ever talked about this before, but for a long time, I've been thinking about sports very differently, in that I think that people created sports because we wanted to figure out a way to give ourselves an opportunity to value time at a higher level. You know, so if you're just doing your everyday life and you're walking along, like a half an hour may not mean much to you. 10 minutes might not mean much to you. 5 minutes might not mean something to you. But if you're playing basketball and there's only 5 minutes left on the clock, all of a sudden that 5 minutes becomes extremely intense. Your focus, your presence becomes heightened in that ability. So it's like, if we can take time and create a container out of it and turn it into a game, all of a sudden that game also teaches you how to make sure that you're learning how to value time differently. The weird irony in all of this is, especially when you start running your own business, is that you realize that applies big time to life. But it's very, very difficult to stay present in all of those things enough to remember that those little margins make a big difference in the outcome of your life.
Yeah, sure. Exactly.
You know, so on track, it's one thing, like you win, you don't win, you get, big dopamine hit for winning, you lose, and you got to deal with the consequence of what that is. But it stays and goes pretty quickly. But then you get into long-term life decisions and you start applying those same risk versus reward factors to them. And we forget how important each moment is of everything that you do to the outcome of what's going to happen at the next corner you're about to go to in the next corner.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot there that unravels from that for sure.
Yeah. So I think in that aspect, you know, that's part of what I learned about risk and reward, and what I took away. Still, you know, take away from racing is that if you zoom out a little bit more and look at it a little bit more holistically, that those scales can look very different. You know, when you're in the moment of doing something, there's one, you know, look at the scales, and then you know, a lot of racing comes down to that the driving, the actual competition part. During that, if you're thinking about risk and reward, you know, there's that joke in Top Gun, you know, like if you think you're dead, you know, kind of thing. And there's a lot of truth to that if you're thinking about risk and reward, which you said you were, you know, then, you know, that is not going to optimize your outcome. It just isn't.
And it will also rob you of the joy of that moment. Same thing.
Probably, right.
Probably, you know what I mean? Yeah.
You know, one of the things that has kept me out of it for a while is that I knew that I would struggle to go into it without leaving that behind for that portion, you know? And that just isn't appealing to me to go into that competition and enter that aspect of it still thinking, you know.
That it's a must to win? Is that what you're saying? Or?
No, worrying about the risk of it during that portion of it. You know,
right. Well, we even knew. So, context is important here, which is that when we started racing, we didn't have any money, and we didn't have any resources really. Our father, who enjoyed racing with his father, and did it at a regional level, helped us get a truck and a trailer that would allow the very first car that we had, which was a first generation RX-7 that we shared to go through driving school and do all of that. But the risk and reward in the beginning there was so different on what it felt like because we had so little resources to solve problems if something went wrong. Racing is definitely, I would imagine, much more enjoyable when you have the resources to be able to have the freedom to not have to think about it. You know, those are two...
so I made a conscious decision, and we've never actually talked about this, but it was literally a conscious decision for me. And it's, you know, there are tropes that turn out to be true. And one of the tropes is if you can't push your race car off a cliff and, you know, be okay with it, then don't take that car racing because, you know, that's showing that you're not in the right place. And I made a conscious decision that I would not race if I was going to be worried about that financial impact once I had hit the racetrack. It stressed me out to no end right up until that moment.
And then you could
I could turn it off and did turn it off and made sure that was a part of it.
Okay, so that is a critical thing that differentiates you from everybody else, right? Is that you could turn it off. Do you have any idea how you did that? Do you know... I mean, obviously, one part was that you made a conscious decision to decide if I did all of this work up until this point, I'm going to give myself the freedom to turn it off. But it's difficult. I think one thing that is important to talk about is that there's a massive difference between being able to think something and then be able to emotionally execute something, right? You can intellectually understand something all day, but your ability to emotionally execute it can take so much practice and time. And so do you remember having to develop that as a skill, or was that just something that you had an ability to compartmentalize that in a way that the rest of us couldn't?
Yeah, that, I mean, I guess it's tough. Part of it is it's 20 something years later, right? To try and look back at that. I think that, and like most things, there's some level of nature and nurture, level. Naturally, I seem inclined with a different mentality than a lot of people. So I think that plays somewhat of a part to it. We grew up playing sports at a pretty, high level, which is different risk, but, we talked about that the physical, I think that took away a lot of the fear of the physical risk that, some motorsports participants still can't shake, but that was not a part of my risk,
And we were
profile.
racing with other people who we could see that was a factor for them.
Yes. Yeah. And then, like everything else, so I guess there were two other aspects that came into it. One was, I already talked about, the practice and learn and create a risk profile based on what you know. And that, I got out there and took every opportunity I could to just get out there and try it and learn. And within that, it changed how I felt about, the risk profile of the driving portion of it, being on track there, because I had just so much experience, with it, and what I was doing out there. And then the other piece is that we went from a very low spot, and, I took it a little bit further, but we, progressed through different levels. And I learned about myself and my own resilience and my own capabilities, and felt more confident, or less risky as I went through that. Ironically, with things that, you would think would turn you off to it, but a car gets crashed, and learning that, okay, I can take it all apart and fix it, and I can be the one that does that, and that's how I can solve this problem, and that's why it's not that risky to me if a car crashes, or if I make a mistake and hurt the car, I can rebuild it.
The image of the consequence, sometimes once you've already faced it, then you understand, like, if I've done it once, I can do it again, which is it's the core of resilience anyways, right?
Yeah, so I think, so that changes your risk, your sense of risk. Yeah. And to my mind, makes it more real, more true, I guess. It's always real, but more true is that you understand what's the true risk. You have these perceptions of what could be the risk. Right. And then when you go out and do it, and that's one of the things about just experience in life of any, whatever the activity is.
So what did you find was the real risk the higher level you went? Because I, like you said, we did regional stuff together, and it was very clear that your trajectory was going to, continue keeping you going into higher levels of racing. So what did you learn as you got into those higher levels? Like, what was the thing that you got out of that you didn't know when you went into it?
So I guess I knew it, but I guess the part that I ultimately identified as the risk that was too much for me, ironically, had nothing to do with what most people look at as a motorsports risk, but just the level of commitment. Yeah. That to be at the tippity top end is a 100% commitment. And we already talked about the small difference in performance between the absolute peak and the next level. Yeah. Has a huge impact on what the outcome is there. The life of being, middle of racing is not very,
but that's
not very
probably true of life in
me,
general. Yeah.
But it actually takes 99% of the input of being at the very, very top. Yeah. And then being at the very, very top just requires everything to be maxed out. And I looked at it and said, can I put in that level of commitment over time for that expected outcome? And that, just didn't quite hold water to me anymore. So that's the risk that I saw, was that you invest, you talked about time being the critical thing. Yeah. On some level or another, you're investing time and money. Yes. some level of physical, ness, but primarily time and money.
Yes.
You're risking an enormous amount of it. And then, what's the reward there?
Right. It's also a uniquely individual endeavor. You know what I mean? So you're risking a tremendous amount, and there are other people who are participating in the risk and the reward with you on that journey, but nobody is experiencing the risk and nobody is experiencing the reward at the same level that you are, which is very, very similar to doing a business. Very similar to what that ride is, and you realize that also you have to be all in. So it'd be very difficult to be able to develop a business and try to become a professional driver unless your business was being a professional driver.
Right.
And I think that's, from what I remember, was sort of where you decided to go in a direction of like, okay, well, let me build a business because the business of being a professional driver became unappealing to you.
Right. And then there was, a couple of outside factors. I shifted my career from a car-oriented career to outside of that, so that also changed the value of the racing portion of it. Yeah. And frankly, the economy in 2008 just changed, things and the money factor of it.
Right. Racing doesn't seem to weather big shifts in the economy all that well.
Right. So, that is kind of where that fell for me. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to read question number 2. We'll go back and forth. So this means that you'll have all of the odd questions. I'll have all of the even questions. So even if we skip one, we can kind of go back in that direction. Okay. So this question is, as someone becomes more aware of that difference, how do they learn to make decisions quickly without becoming careless? And I think when we say more aware of the difference, I mean the difference between performing at a higher level or performing at a lower level. Whatever that thing is that you figure out the difference between. So how would we take, what we're talking about in racing and being able to identifying what the reward is that you're trying to achieve, and then being honest with yourself about the amount of risk that you're going to have to take to be able to equalize that. How do you start to build a framework for your mindset that allows you to be able to apply that not only to what we're talking about with racing, but anywhere that it would go from there?
Yeah, and that's where I really like the multiple levels of racing. Mm-hmm. Because, the first place and the majority of your input is actually in getting to the race. And in that, there's a lot of just straightforward engineering and doing it, measuring the change, and then learning how to repeat what works, find the things that don't work, almost scientific method and keep and making sure that you keep going with the things that are working, and then changing one variable at a time. And you get into it to do it well, you have to develop a process,
right? And
follow through on that process. And the more consistently if you watch the top teams, they have very good processes for all of that.
Yes.
Car preparation, getting to the track, developing the car, all of that has this level of process that you get taught that is very applicable to being successful in a lot of things. Right. It's really helpful. Because one of the other things about racing is that level of complication, like to think about taking a mechanical device that has 2,000 plus parts in it that, has miniature explosions happening every quarter of a second that make it go, that have, all these complex things happening, and take it hundreds of miles away and then run it at an absolute peak of its mechanical capability for hours and hours and try and, maximize that. And then if something unexpected happens, repair it, fix it, do whatever, again, hundreds of miles away from wherever you are and whatever, how you built it, how you developed it,
without a whole shop to be able to figure this out with, the tools that you can take on a trailer.
Yeah, kind of thing. that requires a mental mindset that is, very helpful for other parts of life. And we've talked about already the like resiliency that especially when you start as an amateur and a one man, band kind of thing.
Right.
You go out there and you're trying to figure all that out.
Yeah.
And you learn both. So there's that part, learning what investments make sense and what ones don't. Like I said, you have to run a business. You have to manage the money aspect of it to some sensible form, because that's going to make you successful or not as quick as anything else in racing, honestly. So just learning how you can both stretch finances, and it really helped me learn how to focus on what actually brings performance from a financial standpoint, which as a business owner is huge. So in racing, the measurement is just, do you go faster, which is nice because there's a clear clock on that.
Right.
For business, depending on what your business is and whatever, to me, it's what is bringing value to my customer.
Right.
And if my dollar is not, the closer I can get my dollar to aligning with that and every dollar that I, bring in and let go out,
right,
the more successful I'm going to be. Which in racing, if you wasted money on, an extra fancy paint job that doesn't make you go faster, and you don't have the best tires, you're not going to be as successful as somebody who gets the best tires.
Right.
In business, if you waste your money on a fancy lobby for your, thing or whatever it is, but you're not transferring that value to the client, somebody's going to be able to beat you.
No, that's a very practical application of that. The one thing that I was thinking when you were saying that too is just that earlier you brought up how racing is such an immediate risk and reward. You know what I mean? Especially when you're driving, if you try something and it doesn't work, immediately. If you try something and it works, that's a little bit harder to figure out whether immediately. You can go back later on and look at your lap times and be like, okay, I think I could, make that correlation. But the thing that I do think, at least in my experience, I don't know what your experience is with this, to me, it's like the intensity of what you learn from racing and that particular thing that you're learning is really helpful to be able to bring into whatever else you want to do in your life. In this particular case, try to run a business. But the thing that is different, at least that I've experienced, is that in business, a lot of the decisions that you're making, you have to learn how to be very patient with figuring out how to measure the outcome. Because you're not always getting the immediate, like, I made this decision and then immediately I knew whether it worked or it didn't work. It's like I tried to hire somebody into this position and I had to give that 3 months, 6 months, a year, to go in to figure out where this is going to work and where it's not going to work. It's, so it's exactly the same lesson. It's just the time scale in which you have to allow yourself to be able to play it out seems to be a bit, part of what the mental thing that you have to go through.
Right. And that's where I think sports in general creates these microcosms, where things happen in a shorter timeline, but you get, it which isn't the same as life, but gives you a preview or and racing, is the same, right? Where it's condensed into a shorter picture in that way. One thing I will say about that timeline though, is there is an aspect of racing that also taught me the patience for business. Yeah. In that, one, like realizing that continuous steps forward, ultimately, and that in a lot of ways your biggest competitor is yourself. Yeah. That like you can't change what the other guy is doing until you're very, close, kind of thing. Yep. To get there, you have to focus on your thing and maximizing that, and that could take a while. I went to the racetrack every day that I could and stood there with my helmet and just said, anybody that will let me in their car to either ride or drive, I will do it. And I did, thousands of laps to do that. And then I tested my car as much as I possibly could, and, knew that progression, would take a while, and that would ultimately get me there. But it took a while,
and it's even more complicated than that, because you had to build a career at the time where you could be at the track anytime you wanted to be there. There's a lot that goes into the complexity of how you do that. But that's a really good point, that racing does give you a little bit of both sides, where you get that immediate interaction with risk and reward, but you also have this long-term, okay, I can see where I am right now, and I know that I need to both improve the performance of my car and I need to improve my driving, and so I need to pick off what are all the things that I can actually start doing. Now, the other side of that I think is really applicable to life, and I'll just say from my side, because I think when I was doing that racing, I was also running into a lot of insecurities in my own life, just things that I was going to struggle with on and off the track. And it also leaves you a lot of room to be like, it's not me. My car's a piece of shit. Like, if I had that car, I would definitely be winning races. And they must be cheating, because there's no way that I'm going this fast and they're going that fast. And a couple of times, not a ton, but I got a chance to get in somebody else's car who I knew, or you got into my car or something like that. And you get somebody who gets into your exact equipment and then goes faster than you, or you get in somebody else's equipment that's bitching about it and you go faster than them. And it's, I thought I'm very grateful whether I was capable of being able to learn the lesson at that time or not. I'm very grateful that you and I, as young people, experimented with that concept, because that degree of accountability is also unbelievably important for the rest of your life, when you're like, okay, I can't give myself excuses anymore. I either want to win this or I don't want to win this. And the difference is going to be no excuses.
Yeah. I talk about racing is sort of unique in the sports world. I think the sports world in general teaches a lot of personal accountability, right? And even within team sports, there's a lot. It's clear, and especially nowadays with all the level of tracking and numbers that they can do with it and everything, there's a lot of accountability. Racing is unique, and you mentioned it, that there's a lot of outside factors that you would think would take away accountability, and on some level do give that you can see it, Formula One changes the rules and the Max Verstappen is not winning, even though, he might be the best driver, but you need that other part.
Yeah.
What I feel like this is very unique to racing, in that it teaches that in the greater portion of life outside of sport, there are a ton of outside factors that do have a real effect, that actually, influence your performance, your life, whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
But still, the single most important factor and the ultimate outcome is, what do you do?
Yes.
And so you doing the right thing doesn't guarantee that you're going to win a race. And you can be the best, and you can, try and get in the best team, and you can, try and get in the best car, whatever. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to win. And you have to be able to mentally accept that in racing too, is kind of an interesting thing. But you also learn that the only way that you can actually get there is doing your best. And that, despite all those, inclusive of all those other outside factors, the most important thing that you can do for success is maximize what you can do. And
the closest thing that I think you could get in racing to a guarantee is that if you put the best driver in the best car, you almost have a guarantee that is going to be the winning combination. And I would say that that's also true in life, is that if you take the best leader and you put it in the best organization, that's also your best shot at being able to win whatever field of competition you're trying to do. It's a journey to try to figure out how, if you're not the best leader in the best organization when you start, or you're not the best driver in the best car, how you create the resilience necessary to be able to figure out how you don't lose sight of becoming that.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the interesting things about racing. And you go to the track and it rains, and you didn't expect that, and that disadvantages you in some way, and that turns into you didn't win that weekend, and you have to learn to just take that, and take that in as part of that's the way that the world works, and there's a million variables that come into it, and you have to take those variables, and sometimes those variables are going to keep you away from your peak performance or winning or whatever. Sometimes they might help you, sometimes they fall in your favor. There is that cliche, it sort of comes from racing, that preparation is the key to success, that preparation breeds opportunity, kind of those kind of things. I think that racing, more so than everything else, teaches you, soccer, you go and it rains and both teams get rained on, and it might help or hurt. There's home court advantage, those kind of things. But racing brings together more of those outside pieces and still asks you to perform, or you still, in my case, feel personally motivated to perform. Yeah. And it's something that I've carried, especially within business, I feel like it makes me more calm to be able to look at the playing field of business and say, there's things I can't control, there's tariffs and there's, this and that. And I'm still going to look at what can I do today? What's the picture? What's the path that I'm, charting here, and how can I maximize that with what I got? And
it's the two things that I got out of racing, which I wouldn't have thought that these would have been the two biggest lessons for me. But number one was, it might have even been you who taught me this, but I don't remember at this point. But somebody gave me a technique when I got into the car of constantly unraveling my hands from the steering wheel every once in a while. Because what I was finding is I would start a race and then I would end the race. And by the time I was done with the race, my hands were so tight that I couldn't even unravel my fingers anymore. And maybe I explained that to you or somebody else, and you guys were all like, yeah, you shouldn't be that way. But once I did that and I started to loosen up a little bit, it loosened up my ability to be able to drive at a different level. It was like just making sure that I wasn't carrying my tension unintentionally somewhere, that I was, I don't know, is that in your subconscious or is that in your conscious by the time you're doing that? That was one thing. And the second thing is I had a race against somebody, Nick.
Oh, yeah.
And in my mind, Nick was unbeatable, because he was everything that you were talking about, 100% dedicated, had good equipment, was a great driver, all of those things. So every time I always went out on the track, I'm like, okay, well, what position could I get behind you? And then if Nick, and then, you know what I mean? I was already putting myself further back in that. And I had this one race where just everything clicked in whatever way it needed to, and I ended up passing Nick and then moving. I think I probably made it up to second place, and as soon as I passed Nick, I started to get nervous. And then I was looking in my rearview mirror the whole time, trying to just figure out how I could play defense. How could I avoid, how could I keep this position and not give it up to him? And if I could just beat this one person, that would be the victory. That would be first place. And took me a long time, like decades, if that's how long it's been, to realize that that was a massive lesson that I should have been learning in that moment, was that you don't look behind you. You only go forward. You keep your foot on the gas and you just focus on what's in front of you, and you're only out there to win. That's it. There's if you don't win, okay, you got to deal with that, but you don't go out on the track to try to figure out who are the 3 or 4 people in front of you that you're going to give a win to so that you can mentally accept 5th place before you even start. You got to go out there and just be like, well, there's no reason why they deserve the win more than I do. I'm here. And then the results will tell you whether you did or did not deserve.
On that particular.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe you didn't do the prep. I know just because of our backgrounds, like I have never gotten into watching MMA. I'm not, I'm like, there's so much of that I'm not familiar with to understand the craft of what those guys are doing. But I've been obsessed with listening to their interviews afterwards. I also have really enjoyed listening to professional boxers be interviewed, because there is a level of honesty to the way that they describe their preparation for their sport that also reminds me of racing a little bit in that way, where it's like, man, when you step into that ring or you step into an octagon, there's just you and one other person, and the result is likely going to be the consequence of what you did before you stepped into the ring.
Yeah.
That's a lot. There's like so much accountability in that I think it's
similar
really amazing.
in that if you don't prepare properly, you probably have 0% chance of success.
Yes.
But even if you do prepare properly, you also still have to perform in that moment, and you could just get caught by like something unpredictable
in
or
either
something like that,
direction.
in either direction.
You could get lucky and get better than what you should have gotten, and you could get unlucky and
over the course of it, it probably plays out that you end up where you deserve to be.
Agreed.
Kind of thing. But there is that interesting like difference of the preparation is still incredibly important, and then somehow it shifts to this incredibly intense, incredibly focused thing where you're no longer thinking. And I thought about it earlier, but didn't get a chance to talk about it. When you transition to the track, and you talked about how you were actually thinking about risk out there.
Yeah.
I think part of it for me too was and still is that, in the best case, you go out there and you've practiced enough and you feel connected enough, or however you want to call it, there's that you are intensely just focused on that activity, not even the result. You're literally just in this moment. I need to be braking, and I feel this tire doing this, and I feel this tire doing that. And that sounds ridiculous to people that haven't been there, but I practiced enough that I could tell you what was happening with each of the four tires, where the car was in its power band, how that was going to affect the performance of what I was trying to do in that moment, what the weight transfer was and how that was going to affect the brakes, where I was on the track and whether there was a grip level difference there versus somewhere else.
Your mind and your body became attuned to all of those things.
And that's a level of focus that is in a lot of ways like completely separate from everything that has gotten you there, right? You are so 100% in that moment, and that's the only way to be at, you have to be 100% in that moment. But one of the interesting things is the only way the best way maybe to free yourself up to be 100% in that moment is to prepare.
Yes.
You can maybe get there without preparing, and there's nowadays I can jump in a go-kart and get pretty closer to that because I've 20 years ago spent the time doing it kind of thing.
You've got the accumulated seat time to allow that to happen.
Whatever that is. But that is the other interesting, not the other, another interesting part about racing, that that level of focus and attention to input and everything for that long is unique. So we talked about just the focus, but the amount of processing that you have to do for 2 hours at a time, or something like that, or 3 hours at a time, is pretty unmatched by anything else. There are other endurance things. If you mentioned Alex Horn, if he's climbing a wall, he's got to be paying attention.
Right.
But there's not as many outside inputs. Like you're not moving literally 100 miles an hour.
Right.
And all
It's
the things
slow, and he's methodically figuring that out.
Yeah.
It was a documentary that I watched the other day, which I would highly suggest if you haven't seen it. But on Netflix, there was a documentary about the America's Cup in sailing. And I don't know if you know the story of this, but apparently America won the America's Cup like for 136 years in a row. And it was like this, what looked like this group of sort of old white guys that had figured out how to make sure that they would never let anybody win the America's Cup. And it was always in Rhode Island, and they were making a ton of money off of it being a spectator event. And there was this dude from Australia. Have you seen the documentary?
I haven't seen I loosely know the story, but I haven't seen it.
So this dude just came in and he was just sort of like, fuck that. Like, I want to win this thing. I'm going to be an absolute maniac. And he talks about it on this documentary, all about he just became obsessed, and it was all he could think about. And he just constantly thought about how he could make these micro little tweaks and what they could do. And then he needed to have an engineer. They were every year in that, very much like racing cars, they're boats. You have a certain parameter in which you can change the design of a boat. And up until that point, there had been these like very small changes to the way that they did it. And he went out and he found an artist from Australia. I might get the story a little bit wrong, but he found an artist in Australia who had nothing to do with boat design. But he said, I'd like you to be our chief engineer. And what I'd like you to do is apply, I want you to apply an artistic eye to the engineering that we do with this boat. And the guy invented what is now like this winged keel that goes off the bottom. And he made the wing go in a direction that nobody would have ever thought that it should go. It looked visually interesting, but apparently was like counter to what the engineering of the time was. And they came to the America's Cup. They hid the keel so that nobody could see it. They went through all these things, and then they just crushed everybody, and they changed the world of boating forever. But I always find those stories to be so interesting, because on one side, people, I think, look at that and they're like, oh, that would be an amazing experience, but you don't understand what it is to be obsessed with something and how that also has a burden to it. Like, if you're racing, it can be so consuming all the time to try to figure out how you prepare to get there, how you execute when you're there, how to run the business side of what's on the other end of that there's a part to it that's extremely enviable, because when you're in the car for as long as you are, you can make an argument that it is the peak, but it's got to at least be in the argument for what is the peak thing that you could do that would allow you to have absolute presence. That you literally, not only because you don't want to, you can't think about anything else and also perform at that particular sport. If you do, then you aren't actually performing.
Right.
There's just too many things that you've got to be thinking about. Am I setting up for this apex correctly? Am I hitting my marks? Where am I getting on the throttle? I mean, there's so many different variables that you're dealing with. Then you get into what you feel in your butt. Like, can I feel what's actually happening at the tires? Can I feel what's going on? All of those things are happening at once. It's an amazing feeling to have, but I think it's also really important for people to understand that it does not come easy.
Yeah.
You've got to sacrifice a lot to be able to get the level of understanding that you have of how a car works, in the same way that dude had to sacrifice a lot to know how winds change at any given time, and understand how to read clouds, and understand how to,
And I think that people intuitively understand that about a lot of other sports, because there's a similarity. So, if you watch somebody drop in on an incredibly difficult ski run,
yeah,
and you see them jump off a cliff into this massively steep, thing,
yeah,
intuitively your brain just says that person has both practiced and is present in that moment.
Yes.
And you get that. Racing, I think, is exactly like that.
Right.
The two big differences, I would say, is one, a ski run is 5 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. It's the same level of presence. It's the same level of computational, taking in everything, responding. It's the, all of that. I think that would be very similar.
Yeah.
But then extend that to 2 hours. Is, very different.
So I have a question about that, though, because we've both done sprint races, which are typically, let's say, like 30 minutes or less.
Yeah.
And then we've both done endurance racing. And I've almost found that that for me, the endurance racing was obviously harder because you had to sustain the concentration. But I also found that I found flow doing that much more because it wasn't the intensity of the pressure of that 20-minute race where it was like all going to happen in that small amount of time. You understood that you got to spread the time out a little bit in the way that you experience it, and this spreading out of that time allowed me to spread out my concentration.
Well, I think that again is something that people can intuit from other activities in sports. If you asked any athlete to step on the field or the court and perform at 100% almost right out of the gate, that's its own challenge,
right,
and very, very difficult. And
right,
there are some people that step onto
right,
the basketball court and are 100% immediate.
Yeah.
And then there are other people who can be 97% when they step on, and then develop,
right,
or warm up, is probably
right,
the common term for it, into the 100% level,
right,
kind of thing. And I think that that's true of motorsport too,
yeah,
where the sprint race is more of that. Can you turn it on, and can you, just turn it on to peak right away and sustain it for 25 minutes? And that is,
one
thing. And then the endurance gives you a tiny
right,
bit of margin to quote unquote warm up to it, but not really.
Right. Like, just to put that in perspective, in case anybody, for all the listeners we have, like 2%. You know what I mean? Like, when you're doing an endurance race, it's not like you're tuning it down all that much. You're still going as hard as you can, but there's other factors that also make it worth tuning down a little bit. Like, to win an endurance race, you also have to protect your tires. There's things that you do that means that you know that you're committed to the long haul of what you're doing, not that you're just all out, going to do anything that it takes to, to get to the front and stay in the front in a short amount of time.
Yeah. That brings up one thing, and going back to the, original risk versus reward kind of thing that's funny. One of the things I think is different is that I like math.
Well, that is where we differ big time, yeah.
And I just find it interesting in a lot of cases, and talking about what's true, right? Math is one of those ultimate, identifiers of truth, kind of thing. And it's always both interested me and bugged me that in racing, people are like, oh, I'm going to do a lap at 70%. And that's like a common term of like, I'm taking it easy.
Yeah.
And if you were to do the math, they're actually doing a lap at 95% of what a full race lap is, or 90%. 70% is like, it would seem so unbelievably slow that your mind,
right.
The people don't realize that
I understand
scale.
what you mean. Yeah.
And then the flip side, like you just mentioned, you're probably going 2% slower.
Yeah.
And think the actual math is that it's probably 0.5% slower.
Yeah.
Or at most 1%.
Yep.
And that you're actually playing in that little bit of a margin.
Yeah.
And that has always been interesting to me, that's the truth.
Yes.
That, you're actually, that 0.5%
Yep.
is actually the difference. Your mind wants to change it into something bigger. Like, I think that's human nature. Like, because it feels so different, which is an interesting thing that I think does carry off the track too, that like, it feels very different. Your mind feels like it's got to be 5% or 10% different. Like
right.
it's that different of an environment, kind of thing. But the math, the clock that doesn't lie to you says it's 0.5%, and that's just an interesting.
Well, the other thing that I wouldn't have expected as I got better, as I got more seat time and I got better at it, and there's a common theme that's been coming out with everybody that we've had on to the podcast, which has been really fun, actually, which is that it seems like one thing that is a common thread that feels like we touch truth with this every single time is how cool it is that humans seem to get better at anything that they practice. And racing is a really interesting example of this, because if you did slow down, there's a certain point where that would all of a sudden start to feel really uncomfortable too. You know, so like the more you work your way up to getting comfortable at the very limit of what the car can do, you're training yourself to be able to sustain comfort at something that should be very uncomfortable. And when we go back to when you gave Mom a ride in the race car that one time, respect to her. You know, when she got out of the car, the thing that I feel like changed dramatically was her respect for you, first and foremost. And then I feel like I got secondary respect because, you know, she knew that I was also driving. And I might have even taken her, she might have gone for a ride with me too, because she was always about balance in that way. But you just can't understand the difference between driving a car on the road and being in a race car that somebody is capable of taking all the way to the exact limits. I mean, I've told this story before, but you and I have had a lot of different driving experience. I've got a pretty high tolerance for sitting in a passenger seat to be able to do a lot of different things. And I took one ride with you at Lime Rock and somebody else's car, and I was like, listen, I trust that you're going to be able to pull this off, but I'd rather you pull over and let me out right now, because I just don't want to be a part of this. In some ways, I was really proud of myself for being honest enough to be able to bail out of it. In other ways, just completely impressed that you were finding that level of limits in a car that you were just stepping into. And those were in the days where we were jumping into cars that vets and everything, right? Like every Ferraris and Lotuses and all these things that these extremely wealthy people owned these amazing cars, but had no idea how to drive them. So they would let us go to the track and coach them from the right seat. And then occasionally they would ask you to take their car out and drive them and show them a lap. And I always found those to be some of the most fun we had out on track, but really, really, really high risk. Low reward and extremely high risk on those particular laps. But such a cool experience and what you get out of it.
And that's where, like, you know, it's interesting to say, like, how would you actually put those scales out there? So, you know, from a strictly analytical level, you know, you're risking a car that is very expensive, you know, kind of thing, and you know, an amount of money that you can't really support, you know, kind of thing.
Right. Well, we saw it happen. We saw that dude flip a Lotus at Watkins Glen, and then everybody just had to be like, I guess we got to walk away from this car.
Yeah.
It was that was a life-changing event for me.
Yeah, bad one. And the face reward is very small. You get to drive a car for 2 laps, kind of thing.
Yeah.
A different car or whatever it is. I always looked at it, though, that you could mitigate the risk in some level of driving and just understanding the environment. That I was aware that didn't eliminate it, but, you know, you could mitigate it to some level. But the reward is more than what you just saw there. Part of it was making a connection, right?
Yeah.
And that you mentioned that these happen to be mostly wealthy people, and
naturally, in a sport where it costs a ton to do the sport, you're going to grab, you know, people who have a lot of resources gravitate towards it.
Right. And I actually did know that getting to know and also impressing people, right?
Yes.
That there was a value to that, and that was a way that I could impress people that was, you know, helped me to do it. So I was factoring that in as part of the reward. So the, like, you know, big risk, little reward. Mm-hmm. To me, there was a big reward, you know, to impress the kind of people that introduced me to Bob Sharp and, you know, made my whole career go that way, and to be in that world and to show, you know, so when I say I looked
Yes.
at the picture of risk and reward
Yeah.
differently and in a bigger
Yes.
way than a lot of people, I think that's like
Well, I also think this is a really beautiful way for this conversation to unfold because like both of us have a very intimate relationship with risk and reward. We've both taken big risks in different parts of our life. We've both had big rewards. We've both failed at things that we've tried and had to understand how to endure what that feels like on the other end and have the resilience to rebuild. But if we put it in the lens of racing, you are so much more successful on every level in that world because you chose a mentality that was all about recognizing the reward and minimizing the amount of time that you spent thinking about the risk. Now, if you flip that on the other end, I spent way too much time thinking about the risk, and I spent not enough time trying to focus on why I was doing it for my own personal reward. Now, I found that a little bit more in when we start, anytime we go go-karting, but that might be where my risk and reward sits in my comfort level. I haven't really figured this out yet, if it's just because I know that I could replace a go-kart if something goes wrong, you know what I mean? So I don't have to worry about that, or whether maybe there's more of a safety factor to it than I want to give it consideration, although I've gotten as hurt in a go-kart as I've ever gotten in a race car. So I don't think that is a real factor. But I could get into a go-kart and the way that you're describing driving a sports car, feel that level of freedom to just try to stay on that ragged edge all the time because the risk is that low. You know what I mean? So it's in everything. Like I think that the thing that's beautiful about the opportunity of being able to find risk and reward is that it almost doesn't have to be the size of the risk or the size of the reward. It's just your ability to be able to be extremely honest with the relationship you're trying to have with it. So you could get that same understanding of risk and reward by doing something at a lower level. You just have to be extremely honed in to what it is that you're trying to learn about it at that level.
Yeah. And I think that there's a part of risk and reward that is non-personal, that is just baked in, right? So like you're risking a car that does cost $100,000. Like that is not personal. That is, strictly calculable, kind of thing. Then there's all these other aspects that are second tier or third tier that affect that you can choose to put on the scale or maybe not. Some of the things you can't avoid, they are on the scale. That you're risking in racing. You're risking a very expensive piece of machinery and perhaps your own injury. That actually is a reality of it. It's not particularly common. I will say, as a small aside, that once I had that near crash and had the thought for the first time about being injured, and then in particular when I actually had knee surgery and had to sit out for 3 months of and I equate that to being hurt, like it was an elective thing, but my mentality around that, around the physical danger, has changed, and it's a lot harder for me to put that aside.
I understand what you mean. One of the things that I'm hoping that gets explored with this podcast over a long period of time. So like this is podcast number 3. The goal is to, we're at the 2-hour mark? Halfway. Okay. So the goal of the podcast essentially, is to, I might have lost my train of thought on that. Yeah, we'll jump into a question, but let's jump into question number 4, which is that mine or yours? It's mine, I think, right?
Even.
Even. So one of the things that I'll do is I'm keeping all these questions for you. These questions are yours. Nobody will ever get these same questions again. Let's jump in. Okay. So as you progress through higher levels of racing, how did the competition shape the way you read people, situations, and opportunities in real time? I can read it again if you want me to.
So I feel like that was a very another really interesting lesson about that I've carried outside of racing, and that I now see in other places more often, and that is that you mentioned that when you're in racing, you have the ability to like point at things outside of you, and there are a lot of racers who think that I could be just as good as Lando Norris if my dad was rich too, kind of thing. As I actually went through it and progressed, it became extremely clear, which you kind of mentioned, that they are there. The higher you go, the more the people are there strictly because of performance.
Yes.
And that, lends itself to being true.
Yeah.
And, it's ironic that in the lower levels, there's probably more cheating.
Yeah.
And more, of that, like.
Because there's a lot more people who are insecure at those levels.
Yeah. And I found that to be true outside of racing too, that if you look at the higher performing people, especially in measurable, type environments, and there's a reason, and that reason is that they are performing, and to perform at a high level requires that combination of preparation and execution that go hand in hand, and in racing, the higher you go, the more that is true across every facet, right? So in the lower environments, you can compete, and I could win in amateur racing just strictly based on talent, and I could have a car that was not as good as the other people,
right?
And I could have a budget that wasn't as good as other people, but I could, have enough talent to overcome those two deficits. You step up one level, if you have talent and a good enough car, you could overcome a budget deficit and still compete, kind of thing. And then you get to a certain level and you have to be maximizing absolute everything, and you have to be peak at it. And that's the only way, and so that's what I learned from that competition. I also found, interestingly, that for the most part, like, the competition there's a way that it can, and this is just sports.
And you're talking about the difference between when you were racing at the amateur level to when you stepped up and started doing some of the pro races that you did, the difference that you felt in the way that people were approaching the craft.
Right. And this seems to be true of other sports too, that as you progress, the level of competitiveness is high, right? So during the actual competition, the level of, competitiveness ramps up noticeably. It's a noticeable difference that, so for racing, in amateur racing, there's a different ethos around how aggressive you can be to another driver. And also there's the drivers just are more likely to make a mistake. There's just a different level.
There's not the same level of trust.
There's not the same level of trust. And also,
can you describe what that means a little bit more intimately? Because I think if you've never done it before, it's hard to understand that when you're driving in a pack of people, there's a high degree of importance to the predictability in the way that you drive, to make sure, because you're all turning in the same direction, you're all doing exactly the same movements, but your ability to be able to know that somebody's not going to like go into a braking zone deeper than what they're capable of might be the difference between you being able to stay on track and you getting sideswiped by somebody who comes barreling into you. So like, what was the difference that you experienced in that versus, at an amateur level versus when you got to the pro level?
Yeah, so I think, regular roads actually replicate that with a bit more space and less speed, but everyone has the experience of you're driving down a crowded highway and, how are the people interacting, and is there somebody aggressively cutting people off? Is there, are people flowing in a way that, you know, works and makes sense? You know, that there is that aspect to it.
Yeah.
What I would say is that in the pro racing, the level of people who were the people who would drive and cut you off is higher. Surprisingly, like everyone is that person who will drive to cut you off.
And is it as a partially because they want the space, or is it partially because there's a mental component to it that they're now playing, which is a psychological game that goes along with just, you know, because one level is like, can I drive a fast lap? And the other level is, can I drive a fast lap and get you out of your head so that you're not driving a fast lap?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably all of the above. In order to progress, you're fundamentally probably a person who cares about, you know, higher level of competition. You're
Right.
more competitive, so
Right.
there's that aspect to it. And then in order to be there, stay there, be successful, you have to assert yourself more
Yep.
in that competitive nature.
Yep.
And that's true in other sports too, right? That, you know, there's a difference between a rec league basketball game and a, you know, college level, you know, and then at the highest level, it is fiercely and unbelievably competitive.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the respect for the competitors is higher.
Yeah.
And most people think that like that would be, that those would be contradictory, that, you know, I hate my competitor because I'm trying to beat them, you
Right.
know, kind of thing. And what I found is that it's not that way. It's that you develop this ability to both fiercely compete
Right.
and really do that, but also highly respect
Yeah.
the other person, and that
Right.
that's actually the most gratifying, you know, level of competition is at that point. And so that was the difference that I saw. And one of the challenges of trying to go back amateur racing, among a couple of them, is that you fall back into that, like the respect
Yeah.
isn't the same, and the the level of competitiveness is not the same, and so there's like a mismatch there that doesn't feel as.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm really curious what that is. I mean, my guess would be, because I only have, you know, I have a fair amount of experience at the amateur level, but I have very little experience even observing the professional level, other than through the lens of you. You know, but I wasn't interacting with drivers. I've done enough work in the automotive industry to have spent quite a bit of time with professional drivers through their relationship with Jaguar specifically. And yeah, you could see that there's a fierceness in the eyes of anybody who has made it to the highest level. But I also was thinking, as you were saying, that there might also be something in there where you are the kind of person who shows everyone respect, which is also the best way to get respect in return. But if you put yourself into a situation where you are dealing with a group of people who are feeling less secure than you, then there's also a chance that that disparity in security can create conflict in and of itself. Because I remember being on the other end of that sometimes too, being like, well, there's no way that this guy just wins every race because he's that much better than all of us. Like, there must be something going on. When in reality, it was probably just that he had more seat time and he was better, he or she, you know, and that they were better. And I just didn't want to admit it. And so I created this narrative that made me feel safe, even though it wasn't true. There's a lot that goes into human dynamics, and then you put that into the pressure cooker of what racing is in comparison, and we definitely met some of the most interesting people at the racetrack. There are some really fascinating, incredible human beings, and then there are some absolute wackadoo weirdos that you can find out there too. So there was this very interesting people dynamic to it.
Yeah, yeah. So, but to the question though, that's what I would say. I learned that as the competition level changed, the requirement for competitiveness did ratchet up, you know, linearly. What was surprising to me is that the amount of respect among the competitors actually elevated too, which I didn't, I wouldn't have anticipated that the same way, but
Yeah. I guess that's true in business too, that, as you keep moving up through different tiers of who you're talking to, you definitely can feel that there's, you offer each other the respect of presence. You know what I mean? When you can tell that somebody has been through, that they know what they're talking about because they have lived it and they've experienced it and they've gone through a lot. That's different than somebody who's just telling you that they're confident and that they are, you can see that there's a puffing up of their chest to try to represent something rather than just to be whatever that is in that moment. You can definitely tell the difference between those two things.
you also, and I've seen this like in other sports, I think, what's the term, like game recognized game?
Yeah, real recognize real.
Real recognize real kind of thing, that once you've made it to that higher level and you know what it takes to be there, you respect other people who are there because you know that they've done something similar, some level of that. And there's, hopefully a level of, my experience is that there's a level of respect that comes along with that.
I have a podcast coming up on Thursday with the woman who teaches the yoga class that I've been going to. And this very well could have been your podcast theme as well, because I think that it's true in the way that we're talking about racing. But the theme of her podcast is going to be mastery. What does it feel like to have mastered this one thing? And for her, it's 26 poses that she's been doing for 30 years of helping people refine themselves to be able to do that one thing. But I think that there might be a direct connection between, if you learn how to master anything, then you understand what it takes to master everything. And then you have to start deciding, how much time do I have to try to master things? Because it's not, it's not like you can master hot yoga and then go be a race car driver. But you might master hot yoga and understand what it's going to take to be a learner and humble yourself to where you're going to start from and understand the process that you need to be committed to becoming a master at a craft. And you can almost just add up the hours that it's going to take for you to be able to do that. I mean, they say 10,000 hours is Malcolm Gladwell's thing. I don't know how scientific that is, to be honest, but just an interesting way to think about it, right? Like, that the privilege of doing anything that you're interested in and that you love is your ability to be able to reach mastery in it. Because if you could reach mastery in anything, then you have uncovered the truth about how hard you actually have to work to be great at something. And it's never easy, I don't think.
I think I would, there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Which, that it seems to be human nature, that if you learn a little bit about something, your mind feels like you know a lot. Mm-hmm. And you have these, outsized perception of your, analysis of it. Mm-hmm. And the more you learn about something, the more you understand the true ultimate level of complexity and difficulty and all of that sort of stuff. And you actually, you end up feeling less knowledgeable, in some ways is what their specific study was. But I think for performance, that, holds true too, that if you start doing something, I can figure out how to hit a tennis ball over the, net, and, how hard can the rest of it be, kind of thing. And then if you've really done something and you figure out, okay, you can probably get to 60%, of a peak level performance, that without a ton of energy input, and whatever. 70% is another thing. 90%, is a level of commitment that few can and will do, and then the 99% is just truly extraordinary. And that holds true across things. So I think, once you've learned that more, I think that carries over within your own performance environment, you
Yeah.
know, so I learned that in racing, but that's what I said. Like, I see it outside of that too, that you mentioned it in business. It tends to be that way, that if you have good competitors, you know, and you tend to look at them with more respect. There's still competitiveness and there's still that desire and you know, all of that, but there's a different fundamental respect that comes along with that.
Yeah, there has to be, because it's not an easy journey. It's a very difficult journey, and it's very easy to respect anybody who has taken that on, because as far as I can tell, it might be impossible to do it without. At a minimum, it's impossible to do without extraordinary discomfort. And it might be impossible to do without some pretty high levels of suffering that you've got to go through to be able to get to the point where you understand the complexity of something, to have absolute respect for it. You know, and that's part, you know, we talked about it a little bit before we got on today, but it's part of the reason when decided that I wanted to take this on as, you know, part of the venture of what we were doing. I tried to make a commitment to myself that I wasn't just going to think about what it was going to be like to do the first couple podcasts, which is very nerve-wracking, because you're essentially pretty vulnerably putting yourself out there, and you have no idea whether people are going to respond to it positively or not positively. But I just decided that what I was going to do was I was going to make a commitment to doing 3,000 podcasts up front. And because I figured that mathematically almost guarantees that you would learn how to reach some level of mastery. And then I brought Oliver on and asked if he wanted to make a commitment to learning the mastery of how you do this, and, you know, try to figure out whether we can accept from the very beginning that being great at something does require some degree of skill and talent. That's helpful, but it requires a huge amount of seat time. If you put this into racing terms, you know what I mean? You have to have your ass in that seat all the time, and you have to understand what it feels like to have your ass in that seat when you're doing something that's high stress. You know, and I think that applies to everything in the world.
Right.
As far as I can tell, you know what I mean? Maybe somebody's having a different experience than what we're having, and we should be open to that. But I think what you just said and the way that you described it is a pretty strong case for curiosity, that really the closer you get to mastery of anything, the more you start realizing, man, I should just continuously stay curious about what I don't know. And that is the only way to increase my mastery of anything. Like, if I at some point think that I have become an expert at something, you know, maybe pride does come before the fall always.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the difference between cockiness and confidence, maybe that is the difference between those two places. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that there's certainly truth to that. I think, you know, in some way it's a good chance for me to say that, you know, that's been one of the fun, and I don't know how, probably have exactly the right word, but the nice thing is, you know, to see you doing your business, you know, I have nothing but the utmost respect, you know, and that's true of basically most entrepreneurs, but,
Yeah.
you know, and then the way that I see it, your commitment to that 3,000 episodes is exactly like you said, that commitment to seat time, and that lowers the risk table significantly. Yeah. That I think that's very smart, and it's in, you know, going back to that, like, I look at things differently. You're taking a risk to commit the time and the resources to create all of this, and that's for sure real, and that's that, like, defined, like, you can't miss it kind of thing.
Right.
When you do something like that, you know, in this case specific to you, but for most people, like, learning to be that good at something or whatever, the reward is not, it's certainly not guaranteed, and it's mostly nebulous.
Yeah.
But I feel like I like to see how things work, right? And just catch that thing.
Yeah.
I felt like, and still feel today, like I've seen enough things to say that if you can get that good at things, you may not see exactly what the reward is going to be, and you may not be able to connect it now and then in a way that is, you know, perfectly linear and perfectly clear.
Right.
But odds that there aren't a reward are very, very small.
Yes.
And I think that that's part of the unique thing to me, is that a lot of people, if the reward isn't clear and you can't see it, like their mind just doesn't work to factor it the same way, or to look at it the same way, or it just doesn't hit them the same way. There's probably both literal wiring, within people that, affects that. And then there's some level of, just training or life experience that can affect that. But I do feel like that's been part of my life, and I'm excited for you.
Yeah.
And
well, thank you.
that I think that is something that does carry back to sports and racing, but that, your equivalence to seat time, if you spend enough time. But there is an aspect that I will say, the other thing that racing taught me within that is that just putting in the time
Yes.
is not
It's putting in time in the right way.
in the right way.
Yeah, that's right. I think, I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this, but I've always been fascinated because, when I was doing a lot of training, people that I was doing the training with, not necessarily trainers, but people who, that were getting the training, would bring up the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours. That was like a very common conversation. And eventually I started being like, okay, guys, but like, if you are, what you're saying is neglecting the opposite end of that, which is that if you are practicing something every day, you're spending your time and you'll eventually accumulate 10,000 hours. But if you're practicing something shitty every day, you're going to master being shitty at that thing. And to be honest, that was a lot of what I was seeing, is just people perpetuating shitty patterns over and over and over again. And because it was normally happening from their subconscious, they weren't even realizing that they were doing these same patterns over and over and over again. But because we're capable, we're malleable in our mind, the same way that it seems like we are in our body. If you do something for long enough, you begin to create the identity around it, and then you apply that identity to what you're doing, and it sort of snowballs from there. So I think that it's accountability to that rule, which is that if you're, like you were saying, if you're practicing something at a really high level, the chances are that you're going to be able to perform at a high level over time. But if you are practicing something poorly without giving yourself structure, regiment, understanding, of the way that you set the target for success, it's very likely that you just practice your way into being mediocre at something.
Right.
It's almost inevitable that you would become mediocre if you practiced it at a mediocre level.
And it will probably get harder to ever not be, you're going to reinforce mediocrity to a point that you get stuck there. But
in my experience, what it would take if you wanted to get yourself out of that rut is you'd have to accept a death of your identity. And you'd have to let go of this version of yourself where you're okay being mediocre, and you'd have to reestablish yourself that, like, listen, if I'm going to sit on the grid, I'm not going to give it to you, and I'm not going to give it to Nick, and I'm not going to give it to everybody else. I'm going to respect if you beat me, but I'm out there to beat you. That, I think, is it's like you have to completely reframe the way that you think to make sure that you're setting your intentions for where it is that you actually want to end up. The question that I did have for you, though, is that, you can answer this through the lens of racing or through being an entrepreneur, which I think we've established have a lot of connection to them. But in the end of it, when you're doing racing or you're trying to build something that is coming from you organically that didn't exist, and then you're bringing it to life, I think one of the things that you start to discover the further you get into that process, if you really want to be great at either one, is that you realize that what you're actually building is just you. And at the end of that, what you're really left with that has the most value is you. You're building your own ability to be able to do things at a much higher level. And I think sometimes that's what gets really complicated, is like, is my goal to win a championship while I'm racing? Is my goal to get a business to a certain point where it has, where I've accomplished this? And what I've experienced in my life is that wins do not last very long. Whatever that high is like so disappointingly short for how long it takes to get the win for the amount of endurance that it takes to get to a win, it's so unfair how little time that lasts. So at the end of it, the thing that I think maybe is the value is that you're a winner.
Yeah, that you've had the experience, and not in a not just in a Instagram, level way of experience, but that you've had the experience that you can, that becomes a part of you that you can then repeat and reapply, kind of thing. You know. To answer your question a little bit, though, I guess there's certainly a big component and focus, and I guess I would come back to, we said earlier that what I did learn from racing is that there's all kinds of external components that do ultimately affect the ultimate outcome, the total outcome, but what you can work on is you. So that's where I agree with your statement about, that that's the key. The interesting thing about racing and entrepreneurship that overlap, though, is that outside of that, I have enjoyed and found that building up the however you want to describe it, building a team and bringing them in as part of the success and working with them, and having that mitigate or improve, or however you want to look at it, some of those external factors is also hugely rewarding personally, and also hugely important to success. So like it's about me partly and what I'm doing, and ultimately that's what I can control, reality wise. But racing, more than other sports even, teaches you that developing or working with a group of people and recognizing who's just fundamentally good at what they do, there's a big part of that like, valuing people for what their skills are. You may not like some of the people, but damn, if they're really good at building an engine, take their engine, kind of thing. And being able to create that team and that aspect, that was another thing that for me carries over from racing to entrepreneurship. And specifically, like within my business and within my way of working with people, I really like to put other people in positions where they're both meaningful and where their input is, where their output rather is, has a fundamental and measurable impact. So where, people are in racing, everything has that ultimate impact, right? And for the most part, you can really figure out, did you change that tire fast enough? Did you build that engine, and does it have more horsepower, right? Like the team has those aspects to it. Did the truck show up on time even? Those kind of things. Were we ready for the race with all, all that sort of stuff. In business, I find that it's really both beneficial for me to carry that over, and in business, it doesn't happen quite as naturally, but I like to create the environment where the people who I'm working with feel like they are doing something that has a meaningful impact to what the greater thing is there. Right. And that's definable, and that's, going to be, out there, that they can measure themselves, and that I'm going to, but what I find actually is that once that's in place, I very rarely have to actually be the one who does it,
Yes, which from what you're saying, Brandon, it sounds like the phase of learning that you're in, or that you have been in for a long time and that you're beginning to develop the mastery over, is leadership. What does it take to be able to create a vision that people can understand, to be able to put themselves in a position where they can offer purpose to a greater good, and that when they make that contribution, that there's the opportunity for them to be able to reap the reward of where that goes. Like, to me, I'd be very interested in understanding anybody who doesn't think that that is a very logical way to be able to create, to lead a team to something that has the potential of being able to be successful. One of the things that I have tried to explore to the degree that it can be explored, right, is that it feels like the opposite of purpose might be depression. And I don't mean that in a clinical sense. I just mean that in a, so it's like once you start to invest in one or the other, right? Waking up every day and really applying your time to purpose, or waking up every day and not knowing where your time should be applied. The thing is that it is so compounding. So as soon as you start one, it compounds into opportunities that only abound towards that. But if you've been investing in the other, it's also been going in this compounding way. And if you get too far in one direction or the other, it almost feels impossible that you could go to the other side. But it's not. It's an investment of time and energy and focus to be able to understand where it is that you want to end up. And I think really great leaders, which, I've experienced your team, I've watched what you do. I consider you a really great leader. It's about making sure that everybody that's on the team understands how important their role is to being able to get to the end result, which, holy shit, if that's not true in racing.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you can have somebody in racing, especially when you're doing endurance racing, where it's like, if this person doesn't make sure that they're just keeping track of the lap times that are being done on a stopwatch, and they know, all of a sudden you could have no idea when to change your tires because you're not keeping track of where you're at. Put fuel in the car. Somebody who's like, goes to take a shit right before they're supposed to do a fuel change, and they're not where they're supposed to be at the right time. Like, the kinds of things that when you're driving, you couldn't possibly be, you're leading the charge as the driver, but there's no way you could micromanage what's happening. So you got to find a crew chief who you trust. And then you gotta have lots and lots and lots of conversation with that crew chief to make sure that you have this hive mind of result-based thinking that then they can get everybody else. It's complex when you get to that part to figure out how much thinking you have to do to make sure that you apply proper leadership to something that you actually want to achieve.
Yeah, and I think racing does that. When you were talking,
is it an allegory? Is that the right? Like, it's a great allegory for what you can apply to leadership in other ways, right?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about that is one of the other lessons of racing, or just things that I have been interested to see, is the value of momentum.
Yeah.
Both, like, literally in a literal sense of, like, if you can maintain momentum on the racetrack, like, you're more efficient, you're better, like, that's just actually the key. You talked about going fast before, and you talked about 3 parts of the corner, and you didn't mention the straightaway. When you talk to somebody who doesn't know racing, the first thing they always ask you is, how fast does that go down the straightaways?
Exactly.
Kind of thing. It's funny there. But from, like, a life perspective, racing, and this is actually true at the amateur level, I think as much, if not more so, but, like, it carries all the way through. It's not fair. It's the rules are the same, and, like, the opportunity is there, but it's not actually fair. And, you got to just deal with that, and that's part of it. And within that not fairness, the benefits accrue primarily to the leaders. And so, like, momentum, when you're an amateur, if you win a race, you get a free set of tires. Well, tires is the most important thing to winning. And so, like, you go to the next race with new tires, and you're the guy that won the last one. So,
and whatever you didn't have to spend on tires, you could spend on whatever else needs to be done.
Exactly. And if you finish second, you get 2 out of your 4 tires, and if you finish 6, you get jack shit.
Exactly.
So to break ahead, you actually have to put more, you have to do something much better than the people already at the front, because that momentum is able to carry and help out a lot. Unfortunately, momentum works the other way too. And that, we had some tough years racing too. And, we got those Nissans, for people who don't know amateur racing, we started off with the car that you mentioned, the Mazda RX-7. We're in a class. I looked at the rule book for that class and some of the performances that had happened, and there was a particular car that looked like it would give the most advantage for the car, which was a Nissan 240SX. Went out and started building one myself and developing it, and what didn't learn is that fundamentally there was reliability flaws in that car to being
specifically with the engine,
the engine, to being a true race performance car reliably.
Yeah.
And learned a lot about negative momentum. That you put in the same amount, perhaps more energy than the people who are leading or winning or whatever. But you show up and the car breaks after a short period of time, and then instead of focusing on what is going to propel your performance, you're just trying to recover, kind of thing, and that puts you even further, and then the opposite of not having to spend money on tires is having to spend money to rebuild your engine, and that kind of thing. And within racing, ultimately for us, we had to completely break the cycle by getting out of those cars and switching to a car that was, known reliable, and that,
we had to get a divorce. we had to say goodbye to that, and had to change the identity.
Had to do something that broke that momentum, because negative momentum, it can happen too. And
there was an important lesson I felt like there was an important lesson to learn in that, which is that you can't win unless you've taken your certain number of losses. So there's a lot to learn from having some bad seasons, but you can't accept having bad seasons forever if you feel like you've done the work to figure out why you shouldn't have any bad seasons anymore. And that's a very difficult thing to figure out. And it's talk about something that applies to every aspect of your life. It's like, okay, I recognize that we're not where we want to be in these vehicles. What have we not done? Now, you did a lot. You built engines. You did everything that you could to push that. We had the advantage of you pushing that hard and just sort of being able to see what trickled down from that. But in the end, what kept happening was, no matter how much investment you made in this particular thing, it didn't want to love us back. You know what I mean? It just was not the right fit. It was basically an engine that was built for a small truck, not for, to be able to run at higher RPMs for long periods of time. It required us to be able to acknowledge the truth and be able to make a difficult decision to move on to something where we had built all of this equity and understanding in knowing about a car. And the other thing that was really tough about it is, it was like being in a relationship with somebody. When it was good, it was great. But when it was not working, it was like, a total disaster, because those cars were as fun to drive as any car that I had ever been out on the track in. But, it was difficult to go. But I think it taught me a lot of lessons, which, if you look at my personal life, took me a lot of time to play out in other areas. But that there is a certain point where you can do a certain amount of work to make sure that you're no longer the problem in that situation. And then you have to make a very difficult decision, which is, do I stay or do I go? And in that particular car, I think we all made the right decision to get out of that car and move on to Miatas, which were a little less sexy. Right. But man, did they work.
Right.
And it was where all the best competition was. It was where you were able to kind of catapult yourself by getting notoriety and in a very, very competitive class that then catapulted you to being able to go on and have professional opportunities that you got to run. So as like every tough season, if you're not willing to allow yourself to stay there forever, it can be the thing that gives you all the fuel that you need to get better. But if you stay too long, it can be the thing that just drowns you in negativity.
Yeah. And that I think that momentum is sort of a catch-all phrase, but I think it is real, and that you have to work to break the negative momentum, because which, yeah, is a whole different, I feel sorry for poor people. I think that they're stuck in a momentum phase that, most of the time is not their creation, but is real, and that it's sort of sliding away from them rather than towards them. And that, that can be tough.
Money is a very complicated thing. You and I have had very complicated relationships with money. It is, it both keeps people exactly where they are, and it's also the symbol of how you lift yourself out of the situation that you're in. And yet, you can only, how much control you have over money can sometimes be very environmental, and it can sometimes be very much in your mind and what you're willing to explore and thinking differently and all kinds of stuff, right? So it's definitely complicated.
Probably
My
another
suggestion
podcast.
is, based on the time that we have left, I say we skip these two questions and we go right into the final three. Oliver, am I correct that we're probably close to an hour at this point?
You've got about 50 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. So do you want to read question 7, I think goes to you, right?
Okay. As you've carried these lessons beyond the track, how has it changed the way you handle pressure in business and life? So actually, I think that's a very interesting one. I don't talk about this much, but a little bit, that I think one of the big advantages to having raced is that it does give me a different perspective on pressure as an entrepreneur. And I do think that that's where the multiple aspects of racing that I talked about, are more applicable to entrepreneurship and life in general than other sports. Clearly, as an entrepreneur, money stress is real. And, so I, learned about that. We already kind of talked about maximizing the value of the dollar that you have, and,
Right.
learning that kind of focus. And there's just something, being on track in a competition, is a stressful environment. And we talked before we came in here about a high stress meeting, for a business person. There's a similarity to it in the level of focus and stress and everything, but it's not as intense, which makes it easier to be an entrepreneur. Because if you've never had that other more stressful level, I think it lets you have a less, you still have stress about a big important meeting.
Yes.
But it doesn't, to me, I don't feel like I'm as stressed out about it as people who that's their peak level of stress.
Yeah. Could I offer another side of that I think is, so on the racetrack is really high stress levels to be able to perform at the highest level, but you also have the luxury of being able to kind of hold, it's you that has to figure out how to deal with that. The thing that gets a little bit confusing about being an entrepreneur is that you can do everything the way that you think it needs to be, and you're still relying on somebody else to make a decision, and that decision may be based on merit, it may be based on politics, it may be based on things that you can control, that you can't control. So the amount of thought that has to go into being thoughtfully walking into a room to be ready to handle all of those variables, it's definitely not the same pressure, but it's a unique kind of pressure that I think I would love to know more about how you feel like racing prepared you. What is your emotional response when you're in those high pressure rooms? Because I know you have been in them. You've had to make really difficult decisions in short amount of time. What level of calm are you able to maintain when you're doing that?
Yeah. So, and the last piece that I'll throw into it though is that, racing for me, and this is, I did it incredibly hands-on, and was so that third portion that we talked about the engineering and the mechanical aspect of it, and
Right.
you know, all of that, and the like project management aspect of it, you know,
Right.
of like there's just a lot of complexity that comes into just literally getting signed up for, you know, this thing that has
Yes.
a bureaucracy to it, and
Yes.
that has all these hurdles.
There's a
and then
rhythm that you have to understand. There's a
getting
language that you have to understand.
to
Yeah.
an event, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
being ready and all that sort of stuff. And you know, I had many experiences with having to take my lumps and learn from them in doing that. The most, you know, I still to this day talk about like the worst weekend of my life just from like an emotional standpoint. But that has in the long term helped me deal with stress is that, you know, I chose to go down to Pocono Raceway, one man banding it with a rent. And the only way I could afford to do it was that I was renting the car out for the school and then racing the car myself. That would give me the funds to be able to race the car myself
Right.
after the school. And I worked the whole week,
Yeah.
came home, literally, I don't even know if I took a shower or what, but literally parked my work vehicle. You know, I was working in Vermont, came home to Massachusetts,
Grab a truck and trailer.
grabbed the truck and trailer, which I had asked you to pack for me, turned around and drove to Pocono Raceway in Pennsylvania through the night, you know, kind of thing, whatever craziness that is, truly by myself. I was the only
Right.
person. And then to make the story a little bit shorter, you know, the racetrack is in the Pocono Mountains, as you would expect, and had what they have, which is crazy fog, and the test day got canceled. And so I was not able to collect the full amount of rent, you know, so I started off on a bad foot.
Right.
And then also, I had not ended up having a tent and a sleeping bag. So,
Right. Which,
was literally sleeping in a single cab truck, which means that the seats don't even recline, and it was raining, so I couldn't like be out, you know, and I didn't
Yeah.
have enough money to have a hotel, like all the,
Yeah.
you know,
everything that could have accumulated to feeling miserable was happening all at
right.
once.
That's
and
just,
you went off the road with
that's
the truck
just
and
miserable,
trailer,
right? That's just normal you know, challenge that I would call not necessarily stressful, but just like
Yeah.
it's not de-stressing you, but you know. And then the real stressful part was in that fog, you know, I decided that I couldn't afford to do the race without the money from the renter, and that I should just leave and head home.
Yep.
And in that fog, I missed a stop sign and drove off the road in the truck and trailer and damaged both the truck and the trailer.
Yeah.
So now I'm down in the middle of the Poconos.
Already bad financial situation.
Bad financial
Yeah.
situation. Totally by myself, you know, with a slightly damaged truck and a badly damaged trailer, and just have to figure it out.
Right.
And, you know, I had enough money to pay a tow truck to pull me off the side of the road. I drove back, you know, the couple miles back to the racetrack where there was a place to work on stuff and where they wouldn't care that I was working on stuff.
Right.
And, you know, I had enough tools with me, and I
Bent everything into the reasonable shape.
you know, and I tried to find parts. I literally went to a place that had a pipe bender to try and bend something straight, and had never used it before. And anyways, I put everything back together
Yeah.
enough to drive home
Yeah.
and, you know, make it work, and came through that experience saying, you know, that
Fuck
was
my little brother for not packing a tent.
at the time,
Yeah.
since I, you know, that was
Yeah.
only a part of it, you know,
Yeah, I know.
obviously
I'm
that,
just kidding around.
but a part of it was that, you know, I came away saying that absolutely sucked. A part of it was that I came away saying, you can leave me on the side of the road with a broken truck and trailer and a box of tools, and I'll figure out how to, you know, get out of here. And that's emblematic of, you know, there's 100 other things that weren't exactly that, but that happen like that when you're racing.
Yes.
Like that has to be part of it.
Yeah.
And so as far as the specific question about handling pressure in business and life, that having that self-confidence that is based on real experience,
Right.
I really feel like allows me to have a different
Yeah.
tolerance for what others would perceive as pressure, but it doesn't feel pressure the same way to me. My business is, a lot of engineering focused and problem solving along those kind of lines. And I'm much more capable of saying, I can make this decision now and figure out this part of it because I've been through that. And I do feel quite confident that if I say that, I can figure it out and I can recognize
Right.
where that, opportunity is. So, so that's one of the real ways where racing did teach me about, so there's that direct pressure of like being in a meeting, but there's also that just like problem solving, and just, where have you been in life, kind of aspect that business feels pressure, but it's not the same. And like the
Right.
top is definitely not there at the same level
Yeah.
for me. I'm able to deal with it differently.
Anytime, part of what I think was really interesting about what you were saying is that in some ways it's really about choosing the biggest dream you can choose and then just allowing the adventure of trying to accomplish that dream to be the teacher, right? Because there's no way if you dream big that that it's not going to be. And I remember when we were younger, like we were so lucky to grow up in the household that we did, and so lucky to grow up with the parents that we had. Like there is zero, we hit the lottery in the way that all worked out, but it wasn't like we grew up in a family where racing was a part of what we were doing on the weekends. It was a dream that I think you really had, and I was excited to be a part of as we started to kind of go in that direction as a family, but later on. But there was something magical about that time in both of our lives in our early 20s that was like having this thing that felt like it was a really big dream that we were accomplishing, even if it wasn't really that big of a dream to everybody else. The idea that we had been thinking about racing, we had been talking to Dad about racing our whole lives, we had had all of this, and then to actually go and execute that did feel like a really big adventure. And I didn't know anybody else that was in our normal world that was doing anything like that. You know what I mean? We met a lot of people who we became friends with who had also gone through a similar journey of trying to find their way to racing or grew up in racing families or had all of those things. But I think that there was something for both of us in this idea of having this really big dream that we were pursuing that also taught us how to not dream small when it came to whatever else you were going to do with your business or your life or that direction. I found that to be very valuable. And I think that if you dream big, no matter what that is, and if that dream is in line with who you are, it's very unlikely that you're not going to learn some amazing lessons just because life is going to make you eat so many shit sandwiches that you've got to figure out, do I ever want to make this mistake again? Do I ever want to go to Pocono with virtually, with not enough funds to make that the experience that I'm trying to do and go through all of these things? And I would guess that the answer is that you never went back to Pocono solo that way again. We talk about this all the time for what we're trying to do, but it's like every episode we do, our goal is not to not make mistakes. Mistakes are going to happen, but the goal is to allow that mistake to be the teacher to make sure that we don't ever make that mistake again. And hopefully by the time you get to 3,000 episodes, that will be the episode where we make no mistakes. It's just figuring out how you incrementally use every little loss that you have to take to figure out like, oh, I would rather I'd prefer not to do this one again. And then you have to go back and you have to really dissect the why. And once you understand that, then maybe you have a little bit of leverage to figure out how you make better decisions moving forward. Is this me? This is me this time, right?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. As you think about where to place your time, energy, and focus now, what feels most worth betting on? This one's really interesting for you too. I feel like right now because I feel like you're in a transitional period in your life where you've been working like a maniac. Yeah, I think both of us have been working like maniacs for years, And I feel like you are just now starting to get to the point where you're going to be able to enjoy the fruit of all that labor that you put in. And I'm very, please tell me exactly what it feels like and what that, what you're going through.
So remind me, time, energy, and focus, is that what
Yeah,
it
but
says?
you can answer it any way you want to. But as you think about where to place your time, energy, and focus now, what feels most worth betting on? But answer it however you want. You know what I mean? We've talked about a lot of stuff today. I'm just curious where you have gotten to in your life. What are you most excited about for your, to invest your time in? I know you've just bought 2 race cars, which is, we could talk about that side of it, or you could talk about the other parts of your life that you're excited for.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, fundamentally, there's a couple of core parts that just, so family just sort of sits there, and that sounds almost dismissive, but like, that's the core, most important part, right? That's the part that, and also when I talk about the pressure, an interesting thing is that, I learned through all of my life's activities, but racing has a way of distilling to some of the more like pure thoughts about things or whatever that, my family's there to support me, and,
Right.
There's challenges in that for sure. And you and I, lived through that, but that was a certain takeaway that actually reduces my concern about pressure, is that in business and elsewhere kind of thing.
Right.
So going forward, maintaining that is really, a place where I want to keep an investment and a focus thing. And then my business, is second behind that, I find that both very important and necessary, but more importantly, rewarding, and that's a cliche, I guess, an easy thing to say, but it's very important to me and rewarding. And so
Right. But in fairness, like if anybody knew how hard it has been, no one would begrudge you to have, now falling into the direction that it's going, which is that you've had a tremendously successful year and will continue to be tremendously successful from what I can tell, because you're really good at what you do.
Yeah. And I would only just caveat that slightly to say that, like, I feel lucky, not lucky's the wrong word, but I certainly feel like I have worked hard enough to earn, whatever I've earned with the business. We started this by talking about how there's also all these other outside, factors, and that, racing teaches you that there's a part that you can control and there's all this other outside stuff. I do feel like I recognize, or I want to, for my own benefit, continue to recognize that there are these other outside parts, and that what I've put in is good for me, and I'm proud of it. There are people who work harder than me and get less out of life, in that whole aspect. And so there's a gratefulness to me that the outside factors of life have lined up in such a way that for what I put into my business, I'm able to get a lot out. And I very much appreciate that. And part of that is me, and part of that is the outside factors. And, so I have worked hard. I've also, the business has rewarded me well, not just this year, but in the past, as well. And so, continuing to support, grow the business is the other time and focus area. And then I do want to continue, we grew up, you mentioned, in a very lucky family that we had experiences as part of our life, right? Like, I don't know if you would call it extraordinary experiences or just focused experiences, but
I would say we were raised by 2 extraordinary people, and they did everything that they could to try to give us the experiences that were within, what they could afford, which was that we had a dad who was very like had a great job and took great care of us, and our mom stayed home and was taking care of how to make sure they maintain the home. So to have that dynamic is lucky at any moment in time. You know what I mean? That's a really wonderful thing to have.
Right. So, I'd like to grow that. And then I have a good set of friends, and I'd like to, share and spend time with them and develop a more personal relationship. But, but yeah, that to
You and I
me,
could
that's
start. We could start a dating podcast. We could see if anybody wants to come on and do first dates on a podcast.
Yeah. I'd say it's kind of that circle.
Okay, so the way that I always think about my life, and I don't know if we've ever talked about this before, but I always think about my life in like 3 different compartments. So I think, family, and then I think about my career, and then I think about my passions. And that for me, for the most part, for the last couple of years, has been primarily basketball and different things that I could fit into that bucket based on how much time I have between the investment that I'm making in the other 2 areas. But passion, what I would say, is always the place that ends up in 3rd place in my priority list. But you just bought 2 of the coolest things that I've ever seen. So we don't do what I told you before we came on. We try not to do any editing of the show. But if you send me a picture of the Janettas, I'm going to put it up we're going to have Oliver put it up on the podcast because they're so beautiful. They're such cool cars. And now you're going into a phase of your life, which I'm really excited for you personally to be able to go into, but also excited to go and support, which is that you've got these race cars that are beyond anything that we ever experienced in the early part of what we're doing. And now you get to go out and, start to race at a totally different level. How does that feel? How does that?
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. I just got out to go testing in it for the first time last year. I had driven the similar cars, previously, but it's different as to drive somebody else's in testing than to,
Right.
Go race it. It's very complicated, honestly, and it's kind of funny that part of me is really excited about it. Last year going out and, so I guess it's worth maybe mentioning that, I stayed involved in cars and continued to do track days, but more or less took 10 years out of racing.
Right.
We did some of the go-kart stuff, but as far as like actual car racing, more or less took 10 years off. So to go back to it last year in a relatively low stress environment, was actually fun. And I'm as much as the competition. Now I miss the camaraderie and the team aspect and that sort of part of it.
Yeah. But if you tell me you don't want to win, I think you're full of shit.
Well,
because I know you too well, and I've even done go-karting with you where it really it was not a big factor, and both of us wanted to win really badly. So there must still be that part of you that wants to go out and kick ass in what you're doing.
Yeah, I fully I'll own that.
Yeah.
Right, which is part of why. Slow coming back in, and part of why you might hear a little hesitancy in me is that there's to compete. We talked about it, that it takes a real lot of commitment and a real mindset focus and actual resources.
Yep.
And
it's all out, nothing in, which is intimidating.
Right. And so...
Well, not necessarily the way you're doing it, but in general, it's more out than it is in for the most part.
Right. I'm lucky enough to structure it now in a way that it's much different and more manageable on that end. But, that also requires that, my best friend and I run a race team and, put additional effort into having the team and dealing with renters and customers and stuff like that, which offsets some of the, risk on our part.
Right, but it could also be Pocono all over again. You never know.
No, I'm very excited about it. I'm excited to have it. You called it the dream big thing. I do find that just doing things teaches you about yourself, and it helps to bring people together.
Yeah.
And I like that. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to doing something myself and feeling, that it, I've stayed involved in soccer, which, you mentioned 3 pieces. I think for me, I would lump friends and family and friends kind of
Yeah.
the closest friends
Yeah.
of mine,
Relationships.
or nearly family, right? Or however you want to group that in that triangle. And then the passions, I've stayed up with playing soccer for my whole life, and hiking and, and concerts would be maybe the passions that, I've kept going, and I want to keep going with that. The nice thing looking.
Can't believe you didn't put Guster on the side of your car. You didn't want to. You want to give them a shout out.
Not sure it fits their profile.
Yeah, that's might be true.
They might not want to, but yeah. So I do think, to answer your question, that if I look at the pie and those 3 factors, I'll be able to do more of my passion stuff in the next couple of years, and that's fun and exciting.
Well, I'm starting to come to, I don't know if I would call it a belief, because I'm trying to be more and more careful about what I believe in, because I think that's a really big commitment to believe something. But it seems like I'm getting a better understanding the further I go through all of the experiences that I'm accumulating, that the goal is to be able to reach creative freedom. But you might have to reach financial freedom before that creative freedom opens up to you. So it's trying to figure out how you can understand which of those, like what season are we actually in, where do you get permission to be able to allow yourself to be able to take advantage of that creative freedom that you have, to be able to do things that, that were not accessible to us at different parts of our life, where you had to have the delayed gratification time in your life to be able to get to, to those kinds of opportunities. So I'm excited, because I feel like everything that we've been doing for like a decade, we started businesses fairly close to each other, but I keep seeing and learning from the cycle of what you're doing, and it always feels like I'm a year behind you, maybe more, maybe less sometimes in the different things, but it's been very interesting that we have 2 completely different businesses. Like if you look at what we do, yours is very much on the engineering side. Mine, I would say, is very much on the social engineering side from a training perspective, I guess. But the cycle of learning, and the cycle of learning how to build a business, it seems like it must be fairly similar, because I can relate to a lot of what you talk about going through. And I know when I talk about what I'm going through, you've also said that you've experienced either similar things or the exact same things in the way that you have to go through all of these different hurdles. And I'm just excited for you to lead the way into whatever this next version of being able to enjoy your passions are, because I also want to get to that point. I think that that's a really wonderful place in your life to be. I think it's probably time
Should
to
we
try
do
to,
the final?
yeah, let's see. Oliver, where are we at with time?
You've got, 15.
Oh, great. Okay, so there's plenty of time.
Before I open this question, I will say that I appreciate what you were just saying, and it makes me excited to be on a podcast with you. That that this is your business, and I think that's
well.
really
You've seen.
cool, and this is a big.
We've been watching each other's journey for a long time. Not only watching it, but also experiencing the ups and downs. But I know a lot of the things that you had to go through to be able to get to where you are right now in your life. That I've had to go through a lot in my life to be able to get to this point. But it is such a blessing for both of us to be able to be, we've just been through so many things together. You know what I mean? Neither of us graduated from college. We both went on to do work where you really had to, when we were doing the driving coaching stuff, like you really had to perform there to be able to stand out amongst anybody else that was doing that. Then, we've had these divergent kind of paths in the way that we've done it, but we've both been collecting the skills of trying to take everything that we've learned into applying it to leadership opportunities to be able to build businesses. It's been a very interesting experience for both of us to be able to have parallel experiences, but be doing it so differently. I think that it's been really cool because it's been a cool observation that there isn't any one way to do anything, but you have to go through certain things to get certain things done. And there's no way to avoid what that is going to be. Like if you want to dream big, you better get ready to also be very uncomfortable.
Yeah. I would certainly say change is uncomfortable, right? And so to grow from, even in a good way, to grow from not having a business to having a business is a change, you know, and so through that process, there's going to be, you know, that level. The only reason I say that is I know people who start businesses and already have plenty of money and get backing, and it's a very different experience for them, and you know, that kind of thing. If you're already there, it's a different thing.
Yeah, which it'd be super fascinating to have them on and understand what's the downside of that, because I'm sure there is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's got to be a downside.
Right.
What I would say
Different
is interesting about the experience that we've had in the analogy is that like neither of us ever stayed in neutral. Both of us kept it in gear all the time. Like we've both been trying to figure out what that is, but we, you know, even if we were doing it on different tracks, we were learning the same skills. And I think that's a pretty cool parallel experience to share.
Yep. So the final question here is, when you look back on this chapter of your life, what will matter most to you about the person you chose to become? And I read it twice because it's interesting that it's chose in the past tense, not choose with two O's, which would be future.
So let's go to the tense first. Did you see that because you thought that it was interesting that that we're distinguishing that it's the present that you're feeling now is based on choices that you've made in the past?
Say that again?
That like one of the things that's been the hardest for me in my life is figuring out how I become completely accountable for the results of my life. That there isn't anybody else there's no one else that created the results that I have right now. And for a long time, that was just a painful process of looking in ugly mirrors to figure out where I was pushing out my accountability of being like, I'm a great driver, but my car just isn't what it needs to be. You know what I mean? Like whatever the accumulation of those. But then the other side that you get to, if you can focus enough and be like, I don't know, there's people who could get in my car and they could win. So it's got to be me. I've got to figure that out. And the more you start looking in those mirrors, the more you start to also find that like, well, nobody else gets to get credit for sitting here in this seat and creating something that allows us to have this conversation. Like there's an upside to accountability, which is that you also get to take credit for how hard you've worked and for what that creates and for who you become and for where that is. But the premise of that is based on the idea that accountability, the reason why it's such a privilege is because the choices that you make today dictate the consequences that you have to face tomorrow. That seems logical to me. It doesn't, people call that karma, people call that all kinds of things, but I do think that there is a mathematical truth to the idea that the way that we choose to act today and the things that we choose to do today will absolutely be the consequences that you have to face tomorrow. And so it's a series of choices that you're making at any given moment to decide what consequences do I want to face. Do I want to face the immediate consequence of doing something uncomfortable now to get a better, potentially a better outcome later on? Or do I want to take an easy road right now and potentially have to deal with the consequence of the ripple effect of that ease as I get to whatever the result is later on? And I think that that's why the tense of that is written in that way.
Well, yeah, I think that's okay. Good to put it in there. So I guess rolling that into my answer, I would like to look back and say that the choices that I made today, I can view positively for the most important things to me, which is friends and family, and my business. The passions, right? I mean, that's I would put that in a different category of just that there's an aspect of like outwardness where it's I hope that I positively influence the people around me, and that is what I want to do and be for other people, is that as much as possible positively influence, and as rarely as possible negatively influence the people around me. And the closer that people are to me, the more I hope that I can, be a positive influence.
Yeah.
So I hope that during this chapter of life, I foresee, or I feel like I'll have more resources, both, from a physical standpoint and then also emotionally, to help people, to support people and to be a positive influence in that way. And then personally, internally, I would like to pursue some more of the passions, or pursue is the wrong word, but just participate more in the passions, because it's a little bit off of the exact phrasing of the question, but just, I look at it like you get this one period and you might as well take advantage of it. And that's actually another part of racing that has always been there, is that, that when you're doing that risk reward part of it, like, it's a risk to not have ever done that, and to not have pursued.
I think about that all the time.
That,
I think it's,
and to just kind of miss out on that part of life, especially once you dip your toe in it and you figure out that like it's both extremely enjoyable to you and also something that you're good at, so to have not pursued it would be a risk in and of itself. So so to see more concerts and to participate in athletics and to go to more sports professional, to live life that way, is just for me personally the way that I hope that I look back and just kind of say that like I took advantage of time, which was your other thing about that. So yeah, that's what I hope, is that when I look back on this chapter, that I feel like personally I made choices that allowed me to, maximize what I felt like my opportunity was here with this time and this life, kind of thing. Yeah. And that, externally I was able to support and help the people that were around me, and that I made their lives better, in some way.
So this is a uniquely you question, and I have to give it a little bit of context for anybody that listens to this podcast. But I don't remember how old we were when we started playing this game, but Mom got us playing this game called Cash Flow. The earliest memory I have of it was when I was maybe in middle school, high school maybe, so that would have put you late in high school, early college, something along those lines. But essentially the game, it was developed by Robert Kiyosaki, and the game is that everybody has a different profession. You could be a hairdresser, or you could be a lawyer. But depending on what you have, your income and your expenses kind of level you out. So you might have low income, low expenses, high income, high expenses, but it puts everybody as close to an equal starting point to be able to play the game. Then you've got to go around what they call the rat race in the middle of the game, where you can have opportunities to buy property, and you can have opportunities to make investments in things that create cash flow, but you can also get divorced, and you can also land on a doodad, and you can also get all of these things.
Buy a race car.
Yeah, exactly. So, but if you play it right, what you're trying to do when you're in the rat race in the middle of this is that you're trying to create more passive income than you have expenses. And once you get to having more passive income than you have expenses, you get to go to the outer layer of the game. And that's where you can win in two ways. You can either keep collecting passive income to the point where you become financially free, or you can buy your dream. So I'm curious, if you had to design a dream in your head right now that you could buy that would feel like it would signify, having that level of freedom, leaving the rat race, what would it be?
I've thought about that. And the interesting part for me, and I apologize for not answering your question or, kind of turning it around, is that, again, a lot of times I feel like I just don't follow the script in how people think about things. And it was very beneficial to me to play that game and to think about life that way. And, and I'm very grateful for it. For me personally, quote unquote winning or success, whatever you want to call it, is not leaving the rat race in the way that Robert Kiyosaki proposes it. And it's not buying a dream. That it just isn't for me. I find my business and essentially my work to be personally rewarding. That I work with, I really like the people that I work with, at my company. I like what we do. I get to meet cool clients. Our clients do cool things. I learn about how things are made and participate in helping people make cool things and, stuff like that. Gonna try, expanding more and, creating some new products and stuff like that. I just enjoy that. Like that's kind of, fits in with that. So, quote unquote, leaving the rat race for me, Dad comes in and works with me because I think he genuinely just likes it.
No, he
too,
definitely. You can see that the two of you guys also speak an engineering language that I think he's loving it, and
there's a part of me that without money I still would enjoy doing. Kind of thing. So
I guess it's not so much the question. I wanted to give a context that you and I would understand, but the question is less about the money and more about like what's the is the having the Janettas something that you've dreamed about, and now that you're going to get a chance to go and do it, that you can be fully present in how amazing that is to have reached that. I'll say for me, we've been going on ski trips every year, which has been great. We unfortunately can't seem to catch snow together, but we've had a great time. We've been to Revelstoke. We've been all over the place. But if next year I could take the whole family, take Dash and Sage, and we could go heli skiing, I'm going. You know what I mean? Like, so there's those kinds of adventures that are out there for all of us that I'm just curious what, is getting back into racing, the beginning of you being able to open yourself up to really just enjoying the adventure of life, because there is a certain amount of time that you have to delay the gratification on some of that stuff. And then there's also an opportunity where you get to live your adventure to whatever degree you want to. And I'm excited for you.
Well, I appreciate that support, and excitement from you. One thing I will say is that I consciously made a choice a long time ago, back during the driving school days and frankly during racing, to be able to appreciate experiences as much, even if they weren't this quote unquote same level. So I love going to concerts, and it's really nice that I can buy the better seats, kind of thing, and I look forward to that, and whatever. But I appreciated it when I was just kind of thing.
No, it's good.
So it's more of those, and they will probably change slightly, but not in the fundamental of it is to me to just continue to experience, to accumulate those experiences in life, right? And I look forward to that. And in some ways that will probably become a little bit easier to do more of them or whatever. But the reality, my mindset is not to get too focused on what they are, but to just be open to them and then go do them and file them away and, you know, put that in I'm living a great life, and I have so far, and I look forward to what that can be, you know, going forward. So to add to that file in general is more where my focus is than on specific things, you know? And so I've adapted to, like, I feel very lucky to be in a place where doing the genetics makes sense, and I'm looking forward to going racing. It's not, I can't say that I dreamt about it in the same way that, like, maybe you're you know, that most people think about dreams in that way.
Right.
But, like, for me, it's a great opportunity, and I'm excited, and I look very much forward to, like, taking the biggest bite out of that apple and enjoying it, you know, kind of thing.
That's it. That's all. I just want to know that you're gonna, you know, you've worked really hard to get where you are. I'm just excited to see you be able to. The last question, really, what it focuses on is gratitude for time. Now, I don't think that there's a commodity in the world that can touch time. You know what I mean? You can have all the money in the world, and if you have no time, it's worthless to you, right? So I don't think that it has anything to do with the resources, but when your time opens up to be able to have different experiences and you can do different things, I'm just really excited to you know, share those experiences. You and I have been on a ton of adventures together. I think that's probably one of the coolest things about our relationship over our adult life is that we're both up for adventure pretty much all the time. And we both like adventures the same way. Like, I don't know anybody else who we could go on a ski trip, and if you get a lot of snow, it's just like, okay, we're gonna go and ski or snowboard all day long. We're gonna come back, we're gonna eat a pizza, we're gonna go to bed, and we're gonna wake up and do it again the next morning. Most people have other things that they want to throw into that mix, and you and I have always had this sort of mindset for those kinds of adventures. So, just happy for you. You know, we always try to end with a question of gratitude, and I'm grateful to share this experience with you, Brandon. This is a big venture in my life. I know you're starting big ventures in your life, and I appreciate you taking the time and the effort to be here, but mostly that we get to, like, I thought this was really fun to sit down and just share a conversation about a passion that we've had for a long time that I don't know that we've ever been able to cover at this level of depth in any of the times that we've talked about it. So thank you. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. I am very impressed with, you know, what is here, and I look forward to looking back at being, you know, one of the single-digit episodes out of 3,000, and feel pretty lucky to be a part of that. And I agree, this was a great conversation, and I would be happy if I could be somewhere in the future of the 3,000 too, maybe, or something like that. So
yeah, let's come back.
See where that goes.
Yeah,
but,
the beautiful thing about what we're trying to do is that it's just like, I think that the idea of this is that everybody's got something that they know from the life experience that they've lived. So I just want to try to create an area where more and more people can come together and try to have a dignified conversation about figuring out how we unravel what that knowing is, and how do we see each other's life experience as being something that is not only valuable to be able to see the person for, but also they might have lived some experience that we're never going to touch. And so we might be able to grab some knowledge from understanding their perspective. And that seems hard to come by in the world in general right now. It's really noisy. Hopefully this just becomes a quiet place to be able to focus on those kinds of conversations. So thanks for being here. And I think we can officially say this is a wrap for episode 3 Unscripted Room.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure.